On a morning in the summer of 982, a man stood on the shore of a country that had run out of patience with him. He was not tall by the standards of his people, but he was broad, thick through the chest and shoulders, built low to the ground like something meant to weather storms rather than outrun them. His beard was the color of old copper, and his hair, unwashed and heavy with salt, hung to his jaw in matted ropes of the same burnt orange. He was somewhere around 30 years old. His hands were calloused past the point of sensation, the knuckles scarred and swollen in the way that suggests they had been broken more than once and against more than wood. He wore wool and leather, both stained. At his belt hung a knife that was not decorative. Behind him, a farmstead he would not be returning to. Before him, a ship loaded with provisions, livestock, thralls, and his wife and children. The light that morning would have been the particular silver white of an Icelandic summer, sourceless, diffuse. The sun more suggestion than presence behind the low overcast. The wind came off the water from the northwest, carrying the smell of open ocean. The shore was volcanic stone, black and sharp underfoot, slicked with spray. Around him the sounds of a departure, the lowing of cattle being loaded, the creak of rope under tension, the low voices of men who knew they were sailing towards something that might not exist. He was leaving. Not by choice, or rather not entirely by choice. The Althing, the General Assembly of Iceland's free men, had spoken. He had been sentenced to lesser outlawry, a 3-year banishment from the island. The specific legal term was Fjorbagsgarder, the penalty circle. It meant he had to leave Icelandic territory within 3 summers or forfeit the protection of law entirely. If he stayed, any man could kill him without consequence. If he left and returned before his sentence expired, the same applied. He was, in the language of Norse jurisprudence, a man temporarily outside the social contract. The reason was straightforward. He had killed people, several of them. In disputes that escalated the way disputes did in a society where personal honor was load-bearing infrastructure, and the nearest thing to a police force was your cousin with an axe. He had killed Thorgest's sons. Before that, he had killed Eyjolf the Foul, and another man named Hrafn the Dueler. Before that, his slaves had caused a landslide. The landslide was perhaps an accident. Everything that followed was not. His name was Erik Thorvaldsson. History remembers him as Erik the Red, for the hair or for the temperament, or for both, depending on which source you trust. He was standing on the edge of the known world, about to sail 900 nautical miles into open Atlantic water toward a coastline that existed only as rumor, reported decades earlier by a sailor blown off course who had glimpsed mountains through the fog and kept going. Erik was not keeping going. Erik was aiming for those mountains. He had nowhere else to go. And what he would find there, what he would name, claim, settle, and hold through force of will, and what can only be described as one of the most audacious acts of branding in human history, would establish a Norse colony that endured for nearly 500 years, produce the son who became the first known European to set foot in North America, and plant the seed of a mystery that archaeologists and climatologists are still excavating 1,000 years later. He was a murderer. He was an exile. He was the son of an exile. He had been thrown out of 2 countries before the age of 35, and he was about to found a third. This is the story of how a man too violent for Viking-age Iceland sailed west into nothing and built a world where he made the rules. It is a story about exile as engine, about spite as founding principle, about the strange alchemy by which a society's most dangerous reject can become, under the right conditions of isolation and geography, its most consequential pioneer. And it is a story about a name, a single word, chosen with calculated dishonesty, that convinced hundreds of people to follow a killer across the North Atlantic to an ice-covered island he called Green. The name stuck. The people came. Most of them died on the way. He did not care. Or if he cared, the sources do not record it. Before we follow Erik west, we need to talk about what we know and how we know it. Because the answer, as with most things in the Norse world, is complicated, partial, and shaped by the agendas of the people who wrote it down. Eric the Red's life comes to us primarily through two Icelandic sagas, Erik's Saga Rauda, the saga of Eric the Red, and Grenlandinga Saga, the saga of the Greenlanders. Both were composed in the 13th century, roughly 250 to 300 years after the events they describe. Neither was written by anyone who met Eric or who met anyone who met Eric. They are, at best, the literary crystallization of an oral tradition that had been passed down through 7 or 8 generations, shaped at each stage by the teller's memory, biases, audience, and purposes. The two sagas do not entirely agree. Grenlandinga Saga is generally considered the older and more historically reliable of the two, compiled probably in the mid-13th century, perhaps drawing on earlier written sources now lost. It focuses primarily on the voyages to Vinland, to North America, and treats Eric as a supporting character, the patriarch whose children carry the action forward. Erik's Saga Rauda, composed slightly later, gives Eric more centrality but also more literary polish, which in saga scholarship is often a polite way of saying it has been more aggressively shaped by narrative convention. Beyond the sagas, we have Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, an Icelandic genealogical text that records who settled where during the colonization period and sometimes notes why they left their previous home. It confirms Eric's exile and his father's exile before him. It is a bureaucratic document dressed in the clothes of narrative, and for that reason, historians tend to trust its skeletal facts more than the saga's dramatic elaborations. And then there is the archaeology. In the 1960s, a Danish archaeologist named Knud Krogh excavated the ruins at Bratalid in southern Greenland, the site the sagas identify as Eric's estate. He found the remains of a turf longhouse, animal bones, and crucially, a tiny church, just over 2 meters wide and 3.5 meters long, built of turf and stone, capable of holding perhaps 20 or 30 people standing close together. The sagas say Eric's wife, Thiodhildur, built a church after her conversion to Christianity, and that Eric was displeased by it. The archaeology confirms a church of exactly the period and location the sagas describe. It is one of those rare moments where text and ground align, where the gossamer thread of oral tradition touches something solid, and the solid thing holds. We also have climate data, ice core samples from the Greenland ice sheet that tell us with remarkable precision what the temperature was in any given decade of the last several thousand years. They confirmed that Eric arrived during a period now called the medieval warm period, when average temperatures in the North Atlantic were slightly higher than they would be for the next several centuries. The fjords he found were marginally less ice-choked, the pasture marginally more viable, the winters marginally more survivable. He was lucky in his timing, though he could not have known it, and the generations that came after him would be progressively less lucky until the cold closed in entirely. So, 2 sagas, a settlement register, a ruined church, and the chemistry of ancient ice. These are the materials from which we must reconstruct a life. They are enough to establish the broad shape of what happened. The exiles, the voyage, the founding, the settlement, the death. They are not enough to tell us what Eric thought, what he feared, what he wanted beyond the obvious. They give us a man's silhouette, not his face. We will work with what we have, and where the sources fall silent, we will say so. To understand Eric, you must first understand the world that produced him. And that world was not Iceland. It was Norway. And specifically the narrow coastal strip of western Norway known as Rogaland, where Eric was born around the year 950. Rogaland sits on the southwestern edge of the Scandinavian peninsula, facing the North Sea. It is a landscape of deep fjords and shallow topsoil, of mountains that drop steeply to the water, and a coastline so broken and shattered by glacial action that the sea reaches miles inland through fingers of salt water that worm between the cliffs. The farmable land is thin and scattered. A shelf here, a valley floor there, a slope that catches enough sun to grow barley if the summer cooperates. Everything useful is squeezed between rock and water. This geography did something specific to the people who lived in it. It taught them to look outward. When you cannot expand your farm because the mountain is behind you and the fjord is in front of you, and your brother's farm is on the next shelf over and he has no more room either, you have two options. Fight your brother for his shelf, or get on a boat and find a new one somewhere else. The Norse did both with enthusiasm for roughly 3 centuries. This is what we now call the Viking Age, though the people living it did not call it that and would not have recognized the term. The Viking Age, broadly defined, ran from approximately 793, the year Norse raiders sacked the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria, to roughly 1066 when King Harold Godwinson defeated a Norse invasion force at Stamford Bridge and then lost his own kingdom to the Normans at Hastings 3 weeks later. During those nearly 3 centuries, Scandinavians, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes, though the distinctions were more fluid than modern national boundaries suggest, explored, raided, traded, settled, and conquered territory spanning from Baghdad to Newfoundland, from the Volga to the coast of North Africa. But the Viking Age was not, or not primarily, an age of random violence. It was an age of expansion driven by specific material pressures, limited arable land, a growing population, a legal and inheritance system that concentrated property in the hands of eldest sons and left younger sons with energy, ambition, ships, and nothing to lose. The raids were the most visible symptom. The settlement was the deeper pattern. Norsemen did not merely pillage, they moved. They filled every island in the North Atlantic like water filling cracks in stone. First the Shetlands, then the Orkneys, then the Faroe Islands, then Iceland. Each step farther from home, each step farther into open water, each step farther from the structures of Scandinavian society into something rawer and more improvisational. Eric was born into the late phase of this expansion, when most of the accessible territory had already been claimed. Norway itself was undergoing a painful political consolidation. Harold Fairhair, or Harold Finehair, depending on your translation, had unified the country under a single kingship roughly a generation before Eric's birth, and the process had not been gentle. Regional chieftains who had governed their districts for generations suddenly found themselves subordinate to a centralized monarchy that demanded taxes, loyalty, and obedience. Some submitted, some fought and lost, some got on boats. Eric's father, Thorvald Asvaldsson, got on a boat. The specific reason, according to Landnámabók, was manslaughter. The sources do not tell us who Thorvald killed or why or under what circumstances. They tell us only the consequence. He was exiled from Norway, and he took his household, including his son Erik, who was approximately 10 years old, and sailed west to Iceland. This is worth pausing on. Erik's first experience of exile was not his own. It was inherited. He was a child, dragged from his home because his father had killed someone and been caught. He crossed the Norwegian Sea, roughly 600 miles of open water, at an age when the crossing would have been pure terror and pure wonder in equal measure. Old enough to understand that something had gone permanently wrong, but too young to have caused it. He arrived in a new country carrying his father's crime like a family heirloom. The pattern would repeat. Iceland in the late 10th century was not the Iceland of tourism brochures and Björk albums. It was a colonial society roughly a century old, still raw, still improvising its institutions, and already beginning to strain against the limits of what its landscape could sustain. The settlement of Iceland, the landnam, literally land-taking, had begun around 870, when the first permanent Norse settlers arrived and found an island roughly the size of Kentucky, of which perhaps a quarter was habitable. The interior was a moonscape of glaciers, lava fields, and volcanic desert. The coasts offered better prospects, grassy lowlands along the fjords, birch forests that could be cleared for pasture, rivers full of salmon and Arctic char. The climate was cool, but not yet brutal. This was still the medieval warm period, and summers were warm enough to grow barley in the best locations. By the time Thorvald and young Erik arrived around 960, the best land was taken. The Landnam was essentially over. The original settlers, the Landnamsmen, had claimed the most fertile fjordside plots, and their children and grandchildren had subdivided and resettled the margins. What remained for newcomers like Thorvald was marginal land, steeper, rockier, more exposed to wind, farther from the sheltered fjords where the real wealth accumulated. Thorvald settled in the Hornstrandir region of northwestern Iceland, which even by Icelandic standards was bleak. This is the finger of land that juts northward toward the Arctic Circle, a place of sea cliffs and scree slopes where the growing season is shorter, the wind more relentless, and the isolation more complete than almost anywhere else on the island. It was the kind of place that was available precisely because no one with better options wanted it. We know almost nothing about Eric's childhood in Hornstrandir. The sagas skip it entirely, which in saga convention means nothing of narrative consequence happened there. No feuds, no killings, no legal dramas. Just the slow, grinding work of subsistence farming on bad land, tending sheep, cutting turf, fishing, repairing walls, surviving. Thorvald died there at some point before Eric reached adulthood. The sources do not record how. Disease, injury, the accumulated toll of a hard life on a hard coast, any of these would do. He left Eric a marginal farm, a family name already stained by exile, and a temperament that was, by all subsequent evidence, spectacularly unsuited to keeping the peace. Eric left Hornstrandir. The sources don't say exactly when, but by the mid-970s he had moved south to the Dalir region of western Iceland and the Dales, and married a woman named Þjóðhildur Jörundardatter. Þjóðhildur came from a better family than Eric. Her father, Jörundur, was a man of some standing, and the marriage gave Eric access to land and social connections he would not have had on his own. He settled on a farm, acquired thralls, enslaved people, and for a brief period appeared to be doing the thing that Norse society asked of its men, building a household, accumulating property, establishing a reputation. It did not last. The trouble began with a landslide. Eric's thralls, working on his land, triggered a rockfall that crashed down the slope and onto the neighboring farm of a man named Valthjof. The landslide destroyed buildings, killed livestock. The specific damage is not recorded, but it was significant enough to provoke a violent response. Valthjof's kinsman, a man named Eyjolf the Fowls, and that is his actual byname in the sources, Eyjolfur Sor, Eyjolf the Foul, or Eyjolf the Filthy, killed Eric's thralls in retaliation. Now, pause here. Consider the sequence. Eric's slaves cause accidental damage. A neighbor's kinsman kills the slaves. In a modern legal framework, this would be a property dispute escalating to homicide. In 10th century Iceland, it was something more complicated. Thralls were property, not persons under law. Killing another man's thralls was destruction of property, not murder. It could be compensated with payment. It should have been compensable with payment. The system had mechanisms for this. Bought, compensation, assessed and paid according to the value of the destroyed property. Eric did not pursue compensation. Eric killed Eyjolf the Foul. And while he was at it, the sagas are vague on the exact sequence, he killed another man named Hrafn the Dueler, apparently in a connected or proximate dispute. 2 men dead by Eric's hand in what appears to have been a short span of time. The local assembly at Thorsnes, the thing for that district, heard the case. Eric was sentenced to local banishment, expelled from the Haukadalr district. He moved. Not far. Just around the coast to the islands of Breidafjörður, the broad fjord that fragments western Iceland into a maze of islands and peninsulas. He settled on the island of Uxni, tried again to build a life. And for a year, perhaps 2, it held. Then came the matter of the Setstokkar. The Setstokkar were high seat pillars, carved wooden beams that framed the seat of honor in a Norse longhouse. They were not merely furniture. They were ritual objects, imbued with the authority and spiritual identity of the household. Some bore carved images of the gods. Some had been carried from Norway to Iceland during the Landnam. thrown overboard as ships approached the coast so that the gods could guide them to shore and determine where the settler should build. The pillars were, in a sense, the soul of the house. They were the material anchor of a family's claim to place and precedence. Eric had lent his high-seat pillars, or possibly other valued heirlooms of similar ritual significance, the sources use different terms in different recensions, to a man named Thorgest. When Eric asked for them back, Thorgest refused. This was not a trivial slight. In a society without banks, contracts, or enforceable property law beyond personal reputation and community pressure, refusing to return a loaned object, especially a sacred one, was a direct challenge to the lender's honor and standing. It said, "I do not respect you enough to honor our agreement." It said, "What are you going to do about it?" Eric did something about it. He went to Thorgest's farm and took the pillars back by force. Thorgest pursued. The two parties met, and what followed was not a duel or a skirmish, but a small battle. A pitched fight involving kinsmen and allies on both sides. When it was over, 2 of Thorgest's sons were dead, along with several other men. The sources mention names: Thorgest's sons and some other men. The body count was high enough, and the political ramifications broad enough, that the matter went to the Althing. The Althingdia, the General Assembly that met each summer at Thingvellir, on the Rift Valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are physically pulling apart, was the closest thing Iceland had to a national government. It was not a parliament in the modern sense. It had no executive power, no police force, no mechanism of enforcement beyond social pressure and the willingness of interested parties to carry out its sentences. But it was where law was spoken, where disputes were arbitrated, and where a man's legal status was publicly determined. Eric was found guilty. The sentence was Fjorbogsgarder, lesser outlawry, 3 years of banishment from Iceland. The distinction mattered. Full outlawry, Skaganger, literally going into the forest, was permanent and irrevocable, a social death that stripped a man of all legal protection forever. Lesser outlawry was temporary. Survive 3 years abroad, and you could return. Your property, held in trust by your kin, would be waiting. Your legal personhood would be restored, but you had to leave. And you had to leave soon. And you had to find somewhere to go. Eric had a problem that his father had not had. When Thorvald was exiled from Norway, he could go to Iceland, a known destination recently settled with established sea routes and a growing community of fellow Norwegians. Iceland was a frontier, but it was a mapped frontier. Ships went there regularly. The route was understood. Eric could not go back to Norway. His father's exile, while not necessarily hereditary in strict legal terms, had severed the family's Norwegian connections. He had no farm there, no kin network, no patron, and Iceland itself was now closed to him by the very assembly that constituted its legal order. He needed somewhere new, somewhere no one owned, somewhere beyond the reach of the legal systems that had expelled him twice, once by inheritance, once by his own hand. He had heard rumors. The rumors concerned a land to the west, not Vinland. That name would come later, attached by Eric's son to a different coast. This was something earlier and vaguer, a report circulating among Icelandic seafarers that a man named Gunnbjörn Ulf Krakason, sailing west of Iceland sometime in the early 10th century, had been blown off course and sighted a cluster of small islands in the Gunnbjarnarskr, Gunnbjörn's Skerries, and behind them, far in the distance, the suggestion of a larger landmass, mountains visible through cloud, a dark line on the horizon that was not sea. Gunnbjörn had not landed. He had noted the sighting and sailed on. Others may have attempted the crossing after him. A man named Snebjörn Galti is said to have tried with catastrophic results, but no one had successfully explored or settled the land. It remained exactly what it had been when Gunnbjörn glimpsed it, a possibility, a shape in the fog, the kind of rumor that in any other circumstance a sensible man would ignore. Eric was not a sensible man, or rather, and this distinction matters, Eric was a man for whom the sensible options had been exhausted. Sense for a man banished from Iceland with no connections in Norway and a family that needed feeding, meant something different than it meant for a man with a farm in the Dales and neighbors who were not actively trying to kill him. For Eric, sailing 900 nautical miles into uncharted Atlantic water toward a coast that might not exist was not recklessness. It was the least bad option. This is worth holding clearly. The founding of the Greenland colony, one of the most remarkable feats of Norse exploration, a settlement that would endure for nearly 5 centuries at the edge of the habitable world, began not with vision or ambition or the restless spirit of discovery, but with a man who had been thrown out of every place he had ever lived and had literally nowhere left to go. Spite is too simple a word, but it is not entirely wrong. Eric prepared. He gathered provisions, dried fish, salted meat, butter, grain, the preserved staples that could survive weeks at sea. He loaded livestock, cattle, sheep, perhaps goats, animals whose survival on the other end was a gamble, but whose presence was essential if whatever he found was to be lived on rather than merely visited. He assembled a crew. The sources do not give a number, but a nar, the deep-hulled Norse cargo vessel that would have been his likely ship, typically carried 20 to 30 people plus animals and goods. He brought his wife, Theodhildur, and their children, including a young son named Leif. He brought thralls, and then he left. The crossing from Iceland to the east coast of Greenland is approximately 900 nautical miles, roughly 1,050 statute miles or 1,700 kilometers. In a nar making perhaps 4 to 6 knots in favorable wind, this would take between 1 and 2 weeks depending on weather. The route runs almost due west from the Snæfellsnes Peninsula across the Denmark Strait, through waters that even in summer carry drift ice from the East Greenland current. There is no account of Eric's crossing. The sagas skip it, as they often skip sea voyages unless something dramatic happens during them. We can infer the conditions from what we know of the route, the season, and the ship. The North Atlantic in summer is not the screaming gray horror it becomes in winter, but it is not gentle. Fog is endemic. Swells of 3 to 5 meters are routine. The Erminger Current creates unpredictable eddies where warm and cold water collide. Drift ice appears without warning. Not the towering bergs of popular imagination, but the flat, grinding pack ice that sits low in the water and can tear the hull of a clinker-built ship like paper if the helmsman doesn't see it in time. And in fog, the helmsman often does not see it in time. Navigation was by Lade, the Norse system of wayfinding that combined sun observation, star position, landmark recognition, and what can only be called deep environmental literacy. Reading the color of the water, the behavior of birds, the direction of swells, the feel of the wind. There was no compass, there was no chart. There was experience accumulated over generations and transmitted orally, and there was the sun when you could see it and when you couldn't. There was guesswork informed by knowledge so deep it looked like instinct. Eric reached Greenland's east coast. He could not land there. The east coast of Greenland is, to this day, one of the most hostile coastlines on Earth. The East Greenland Current sweeps massive quantities of Arctic pack ice southward along the shore, creating a barrier of grinding flows that can extend miles offshore. Behind the ice, the coast itself is sheer. Steep mountains dropping directly into the water, with almost no sheltered harbors, no accessible beaches, no place to bring a ship to shore safely. The interior ice sheet, which covers roughly 80% of the island, reaches close to the eastern coast, leaving almost no habitable margin. Eric did what the coast required. He sailed south, rounding the southern tip of the island, Cape Farewell, the Europeans would later call it Cap Farvel, and turned north along the western coast. And there, in the deep fjords of southwestern Greenland, he found something that must have felt, after the crossing, after the ice, after the weeks of gray Atlantic nothing, like a door opening in a wall. The southwestern coast of Greenland is the island's one concession to habitability. Here, the fjords cut deep inland, 30, 40, 50 miles into the rock, and at their heads, sheltered from the worst of the wind and warmed by the south-facing slopes, there are valleys. In the late 10th century, during the medieval warm period, those valleys were green. Not green like Ireland, not green like the English lowlands, but green enough. Grass grew in the sheltered fjord bottoms thick enough to cut for hay. Dwarf willows and birch scrub clustered along the watercourses. The fjords themselves teemed with seal and fish. Caribou, the Greenlandic reindeer, grazed the upland meadows. It was marginal. It was seasonal. It was, compared to even the worst farmland in Iceland, precarious. But it was land, and no one owned it. And Eric, a man who had been expelled from 2 countries and had killed at least 4 men and whose father had killed at least 1 more in nature, looked at it and saw not a wilderness, but a territory. He stayed for 3 years. He explored the coast systematically, sailing north along the fjords, landing where he could, noting the quality of the pasture, the depth of the harbors, the availability of driftwood, the density of game. He named everything Eriksfjordur, Erik's Fjord, Eriksøy, Erik's Island. He named the broader settlement areas, the eastern settlement, Eystrabygd, in the deep southern fjords, and the western settlement Vestrabygd, farther north along the coast. He was not exploring, he was prospecting. Every name he carved into the landscape was a claim. Every fjord he charted was an asset in a portfolio he was assembling for a specific purpose. Because Eric, alone on a frozen coast with his family and his thralls and his livestock, with 3 years to kill before he could legally return to Iceland, had already figured out what he was going to do when he went back. He was going to sell this place. He was going to need a name for it. The name he chose was Greenland. Greenland. It was, by any honest assessment, a lie. The island was not green. It was white. White with ice, white with snow, white with the glare of the inland glacier that covered 4/5 of the landmass. The fjords offered pockets of green in summer, yes, but calling the entire island Greenland on the basis of its sheltered fjord bottoms was like calling the Sahara Lakeland because there are oases. It was marketing. It was branding. It was, if the sagas are to be believed, entirely deliberate. Eirik Sagarauta states it plainly. He called the land Greenland, for he said that people would be more attracted to go there if it had a good name. The Old Norse is concise. Han Kaladi landet Granland, oki kvadmen that mjuk mundu fisask thanget, f landet heiti vel. There is a temptation to read this as naive, as though the Icelanders who heard the name were credulous fools, easily duped by a red-bearded conman with a frozen island to sell. That reading is wrong. The Icelanders of the late 10th century were among the most experienced seafarers in the world. Many of them had crossed the North Atlantic themselves or knew someone who had. They understood cold. They understood ice. They understood that a land called Greenland might not be green. But the name did something subtler than deceive. It framed. It told potential settlers what to look for rather than what to fear. It said, there is grass there. There is pasture. There is the possibility of the life you are living here, replicated in a new place where you will not be someone else's tenant, but your own master. In a society where the best land had been claimed for 100 years, and the remaining options were marginal farms in marginal districts under the authority of established chieftains, the promise of open land, Greenland Wanaboi, was not a trick. It was an invitation. And invitations do not need to be entirely honest to be effective. Eric returned to Iceland in 985, his 3-year sentence complete, his legal personhood restored. He came back with descriptions of the western land, with stories of its fjords and game and pasture, with the name, that name, and with the force of personality that had made him one of the most dangerous men in Iceland, now redirected toward the project of persuasion. It worked. 25 ships assembled to follow Eric to Greenland. 25 ships loaded with families, livestock, tools, seed grain, timber, iron, everything needed to establish a colony from scratch. The sources estimate between 400 and 500 people in total. This was not a raiding party or an exploratory voyage. This was a migration. Families uprooting their lives on the promise of a man who had been exiled for killing people and who had named an ice sheet after a color it was not. The fleet sailed from Breidafjordur in the summer of 985, following the route Eric had charted. They sailed west into the Denmark Strait, into the fog and the swells and the drift ice that Eric had survived 3 years earlier. 14 ships arrived. 11 did not. Some sank. Some turned back, battered by storms, unable or unwilling to continue. The sources do not distinguish between the lost and the retreated. They give only the number of 25, 14. Of 400 to 500 people, an unknown fraction, perhaps 200, perhaps fewer, reached the fjords of southwestern Greenland alive. The casualties of the crossing are recorded in a single sentence. The sagas do not linger on the drowning. They do not name the dead. 11 ships, gone into the Atlantic with their families and their animals and their hopes, are dismissed in a clause, and the narrative moves on to the founding of the settlement as though the founding were the point. It was the point. For the saga writers 200 years later, telling the story of a colony that by their time had existed for 2 centuries, the founding was what mattered. The dead were absorbed into the cost of the enterprise, the price of the ticket, the overhead of civilization at the edge of the world. But the dead were real. They were people who had loaded their children onto ships because a red-haired exile told them the land was green, and the sea took them, as the sea always takes some, and no one recorded their names. This is one of the silences the sources ask us to sit with. We can note it. We cannot fill it. What we can say is this: Eric the Red sailed west with 25 ships and arrived with 14, and he stepped onto the shore of Eriksfjordur not as an exile returning from banishment, but as the founder of a colony, the paramount chieftain of a settlement that existed because he had named it well and talked persuasively and survived the crossing and did not apparently lose sleep over the ships that didn't. He chose a site at the head of the fjord. He called it Bratalid, steep slope, and began to build. The wind came off the ice cap, cold and constant, pressing against the walls of the longhouse before the walls were even raised. The grass in the fjord bottom bent under it. The water in the fjord was black and still except where the wind touched it, and where the wind touched it, it shivered. Eric the Red had found his country. He had found the one place on earth that could not throw him out, because there was no assembly here, no all-thing, no law but the law he made. He was home, or as close to home as a man like Eric would ever get. Part 2. Bratalid rose from the ground the way Norse settlements always rose, not as architecture but as a negotiation with the earth itself. The longhouse came first. It had to. Shelter was not optional in a Greenlandic autumn, when the temperature drops fast and the darkness begins its long annual accumulation. Eric's builders, his crew, his thralls, his kinsmen, whoever had survived the crossing with enough strength left to lift stone, would have begun within days of landing while the animals grazed the fjord bottom grass and the provisions held. The technique was turf construction, the same method used in Iceland, which was itself adapted from Norwegian building traditions modified for a landscape without timber. You cut blocks of turf, grass, roots, and soil together in dense rectangular slabs and stack them in double walls 3 to 6 feet thick, with a rubble core of loose stone for drainage and insulation. The roof is timber framed where timber is available, driftwood or whalebone where it is not, and then turfed over so that from a distance the building looks less like a house than a hillside that someone has inserted a door into. The result is not beautiful. It is not meant to be. It is warm. A turf longhouse with thick walls and a central hearth maintains a livable temperature even when the exterior drops well below freezing, the mass of earth absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. The air inside is close and smoky, smelling of peat fire and animal dung and human bodies and rendered fat, the smell of survival at high latitude, the smell that every Norse settler in the North Atlantic would have recognized as the smell of home. Eric's longhouse at Bratalid was, by the standards of the Eastern settlement, substantial. Archaeological excavation of the site, multiple campaigns across the 20th century, from Daniel Bruhn's early work in 1903 through Krog's definitive excavations in the 1960s, reveals a main hall roughly 15 meters long and perhaps 5 meters wide at its broadest point, with curving walls that gave it an almost boat-like floor plan. This was standard Norse longhouse design. The bowed walls distributed the weight of the turf roof more efficiently than straight ones and created alcoves along the interior perimeter that served as sleeping platforms, storage bays, and workspaces. The farm grew outward from the longhouse, outbuildings for livestock, a byre for cattle, pens for sheep and goats, a smithy because iron tools were the difference between a settlement and a campsite, storage buildings for hay, for dried fish, for the butter and cheese that would see the household through winter. Each structure turf-walled, low-roofed, pressed against the earth as though trying to hide from the wind that never stopped. And the wind never stopped. This is not poetic exaggeration. Greenland's southwestern coast is subject to the pitterak, a katabatic wind that forms when cold air pooling on the surface of the ice cap spills down through the fjords toward the sea, accelerating as it funnels through the narrow valleys. Pitteraks can reach hurricane force. They come without warning. They strip turf from roofs, scatter livestock, and drop temperatures by 20 degrees in minutes. Eric would have encountered them in his first year, possibly his first week. They were the island's way of announcing its terms, but the fjords also offered what Eric needed. The water teemed with seal, harp seal, hooded seal, ringed seal, and seal was everything: meat, fat, leather, oil for lamps. The rivers held Arctic char, running upstream to spawn in summer in numbers that must have seemed, to settlers from overfished Icelandic rivers, almost absurd. Caribou grazed the inland meadows, migratory herds that could be hunted in autumn when the animals were fat. Seabirds nested in the cliffs by the millions, guillemots, puffins, kittiwakes, and their eggs were a seasonal bounty that required nothing more than strong nerves and a willingness to climb. The pasture itself, the green that Eric had promised, the green that had given the island its name, was real enough in the fjord bottoms. Modern palynological studies of sediment cores from the settlement sites show that in the late 10th century, the inner fjords supported grassland sufficient for modest haymaking. Not abundant, not lush, but enough to sustain cattle through winter if the hay was cut carefully and the winter was not exceptional, and the farmer did not lose animals to disease or cold, or the carelessness that exhaustion breeds. Every qualifier in that sentence mattered. Greenlandic farming was a perpetual negotiation with insufficiency, a life lived on the thinnest possible margin between survival and catastrophe. A bad summer here seen, too cool, too wet, too short, meant not enough hay. Not enough hay meant dead cattle in February. Dead cattle meant no milk, no butter, no cheese, and a household thrown back on seal and fish and whatever could be scraped from a landscape that offered much but forgave nothing. Eric knew this. He had spent 3 years in these fjords before bringing others. He understood the margin. And he chose to bring people anyway, because the margin, for all its cruelty, was wider than the one available to a landless exile in Iceland. This is the calculation that underwrites the entire Greenland colony. And it is worth stating plainly, the people who followed Eric to Greenland were not fools, and they were not duped. They were people for whom the alternatives were worse. Younger sons who would never inherit in Iceland. Families on marginal farms who could see the trajectory of their lives narrowing. Men with legal troubles, debt, enemies. The same constellation of pressures that had driven their grandparents from Norway to Iceland 2 generations before. The frontier does not attract the comfortable. It attracts the desperate, the ambitious, and the people for whom the gap between desperate and ambitious has collapsed into a single burning need to be somewhere else. Eric gave them somewhere else. And in return, they gave him something he had never had in Iceland and never could have had. Authority unchallenged by any rival claimant, any assembly, any law he had not written himself. Mori. The social structure of the Greenland colony was, from its inception, centered on Eric to a degree that had no real parallel in Iceland. Iceland's political system was deliberately decentralized. There was no king. The Althing was a legislative and judicial body, not an executive one. Power was distributed among dozens of Godar Sirar Duasin chieftains who held their authority through a combination of inherited prestige, land wealth, and the voluntary allegiance of free farmers who could, in theory, transfer their loyalty to a different Gaudi if displeased. It was an oligarchy of competing local magnates, held in rough equilibrium by the mutual recognition that no one chieftain could dominate the rest without provoking a coalition against him. Greenland was different. Eric had found the land. Eric had named it. Eric had organized the migration. Eric had chosen the settlement sites, assigned the farms, determined the layout of the colony. The other settlers owed their presence, their farms, their livelihoods, their survival, to his initiative. He was not a Gaudi among Godar. He was the founder. And the founder's farm, Bratalid, positioned at the head of the best fjord in the most productive district, was not merely a farm, but a seat of power with no counterbalance. The settlers spread out through the fjords of the eastern settlement, claiming farms along the waterways, building their own turf longhouses, establishing their own byres and hayfields. The pattern of settlement followed the pattern of the landscape. Farms strung along the inner fjords like beads on a string, each separated from the next by enough distance to provide independent pasture, but close enough for mutual aid, trade, and the social contact that made the difference between a settlement and a collection of hermitages. Within a generation, the eastern settlement contained perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 people, a population estimate derived from the number of identified farm ruins, the carrying capacity of the land, and comparison with better documented Norse settlements of similar scale. The western settlement farther north was smaller, perhaps 1,000 people in its best years. Between them, they constituted the westernmost outpost of European civilization, a society of 5,000 souls clinging to a strip of habitable coast between the ice cap and the sea. They built churches, not immediately. In Eric's lifetime, the colony was still pagan, still worshiping the old Norse gods, still conducting blots and observing the festivals of the pre-Christian calendar. But Christianity came to Greenland within a generation of the founding, carried from Norway and Iceland by the same currents of cultural change that were sweeping the entire Norse world toward conversion. We will return to this because the arrival of Christianity at Bratalid produced one of the most revealing domestic conflicts in the saga record, a conflict between Eric and his wife that exposes the fault lines not just of a marriage, but of a civilization in transition. For now, note the speed of the colony's establishment. Within 5 years of landfall, the eastern settlement was a functioning agricultural community with livestock, buildings, social hierarchies, trade relationships, and the beginnings of institutional structure. Within 10 years, it had developed regular maritime contact with Iceland and through Iceland with Norway. Greenlandic exports use walrus ivory, sealskin rope, live polar bears, narwhal tusks, white falcons from the northern hunting grounds, entered the Norse trade network and eventually reached the markets of continental Europe. A polar bear from Greenland was presented to the King of Norway. White gyrfalcons from the northern hunting districts were among the most valued diplomatic gifts in medieval Christendom. Eric had built this. Not alone, no colony is built by one man, Beswayo. But his was the organizing will, the political authority, the name that held the settlement together in its critical early years. The man who could not coexist with his neighbors in Iceland had created a society in which he had no neighbors capable of challenging him. The man whom the Althing had expelled had founded a place with no Althing. There is something clarifying about this. Eric's violence in Iceland was not random. It was the violence of a man who could not tolerate subordination, who experienced the constraints of an existing social order as intolerable friction. In Iceland, that quality made him a menace. In Greenland, where there was no existing order, where the constraints had to be invented from scratch by whoever arrived first. The same quality made him a founder. The line between criminal and pioneer is, in certain historical configurations, nothing more than the availability of empty land. The colony's economy was a hybrid, part subsistence agriculture, part hunting, part trade, and each component carried its own fragility. The agriculture was Icelandic agriculture transplanted and diminished. Cattle were the prestige animal, the centerpiece of the pastoral economy, valued for milk, butter, cheese, and the social status they conferred on their owners. A wealthy Greenlandic farm might maintain 10 to 20 cattle, a poor one 3 or 4. The cattle required hay, and the hay required summer. A growing season that in the eastern settlement lasted perhaps 4 months in a good year, 3 in a bad one. Every farm's survival depended on cutting enough hay in August and September to feed the cattle through a winter that began in October and did not release its grip until May. Sheep and goats were hardier, less demanding of fodder, and better adapted to the marginal pasture of the upland slopes. They provided wool, meat, milk, and the raw material for the textile production that was one of the few forms of manufacture the colony could sustain. Goats, in particular, thrived in Greenland's sparse scrublands in a way that cattle could not, and isotopic analysis of bone remains from settlement middens suggests that over the colony's lifetime, the ratio of goat to cattle bones increased steadily, a quiet statistical signature of a community slowly, reluctantly acknowledging that the land could not support the animals it wanted, only the animals the land would tolerate. Hunting was the supplement that kept the agricultural economy from collapsing. Seal hunting above all. The Norse Greenlanders hunted seal in quantities that, by the evidence of their middens, exceeded anything their Icelandic or Norwegian counterparts attempted. Seal bones dominate the faunal assemblages at Greenlandic farm sites, sometimes constituting 70 to 80% of all identified animal remains. In the Western settlement, the proportion was even higher. The Greenlanders ate more seal than beef, more seal than mutton, more seal than anything else. They rendered seal fat for lamp oil, tanned seal hides for leather and rope, and used seal as the baseline protein source that underwrote every other activity. This was adaptation, and it was intelligent adaptation, but it came with a social cost. In the Norse value system, cattle farming was noble and seal hunting was not. A man's worth was measured in cows and hay, not in seal skins. The Icelanders and Norwegians with whom the Greenlanders traded and corresponded would have understood the necessity, but they would also have understood what it meant, that the Greenlanders were, by the standards of their parent culture, not quite fully Norse, not quite fully farmers. Something slightly other, caught between the pastoral identity they carried from Iceland and the marine economy the land forced upon them. Then there was the Nordorseta, the northern hunt. Every summer, Greenlandic hunters sailed north from the settlements, far up the western coast, into the hunting grounds above the Arctic Circle where walrus hauled out on rocky beaches by the hundreds. The walrus hunt was not subsistence, it was commerce. Walrus ivory, the tusks, which could be carved into luxury objects, chess pieces, crucifixes, decorative panels, was Greenland's primary export commodity, the one product the colony could offer that European markets could not easily obtain elsewhere. The Nordorseta expeditions were dangerous, lasting weeks or months, pushing small boats into waters choked with ice among animals that weighed over a ton and could capsize a boat with a single lunge. Hunters died regularly. But the ivory they brought back was the colony's lifeline to the outside world, the currency that purchased iron, timber, grain, church bells, stained glass, and the other goods that Greenland could not produce for itself, and without which the colony could not maintain its connection to European civilization. This was Greenland's structural paradox. The colony survived by hunting in the north and farming in the south, but it justified its existence by exporting luxury goods to Europe. Its identity was agricultural and Christian and Norse, but its economy was maritime and extractive and dependent on a commodity, walrus ivory, whose value was determined by fashion and trade patterns in markets 3,000 miles away. When those markets shifted, when elephant ivory from Africa became more accessible to European carvers in the 13th and 14th centuries, the economic foundation of the Greenland colony would begin to erode. But that erosion was 2 centuries away. In Eric's lifetime, the ivory flowed, and the ships came, and the colony held. There were already people in Greenland when Eric arrived. The sagas mention this obliquely. Eric, during his 3 years of exploration, found traces of prior habitation, fragments of skin boats, stone tools, the remains of dwellings. The sagas call the previous inhabitants Skralingar, the same word that would later be applied to the indigenous peoples of North America when Eric's son Leif and others encountered them in Vinland. The word is usually translated as wretches or weaklings, though its exact etymology is debated. What is not debated is its contempt. The people Eric found traces of were most likely the Dorset culture, or, as they are known in Greenlandic Inuit tradition, the Tuniat. The Dorset were a Paleo-Eskimo people who had inhabited Greenland, Arctic Canada, and parts of the eastern Arctic for roughly 2,000 years before the Norse arrived. Their technology was sophisticated but different from what would come after. They hunted seal and walrus with hand-thrown harpoons rather than the toggling harpoon heads and kayak-based techniques of the later Thule Inuit. They built semi-subterranean houses of stone and turf and bone. They carved small, haunting figurines from ivory and bone, human and animal forms whose purpose archaeologists still debate. By the time Eric arrived in 982, the Dorset presence in southwestern Greenland may have been diminishing. The evidence is ambiguous. Some scholars believe the Dorset had largely withdrawn from the areas the Norse settled, pushed northward by climatic shifts, or simply absent from the fjord bottom environments that the Norse found most attractive. Others argue for a period of overlap, of coexistence at a distance, in which the two populations were aware of each other but rarely interacted. What is clear is that the Norse did not consider the Dorset, Gior, or their successors, the Thule Inuit, who migrated into Greenland from the Canadian Arctic beginning around the 12th century, as having claims to the land. This is not surprising. The Norse concept of land ownership was rooted in agricultural use. You owned land by farming it, by building on it, by cutting hay and grazing livestock. A people who hunted across a territory without erecting permanent agricultural structures did not, in the Norse framework, own anything. They were part of the landscape, like the caribou, like the seal. This is a silence in the sources that we must name, even though we cannot fill it. The Dorset left no written records. Their perspective on the arrival of the Norse, these strange pale people with their enormous boats and their lowing cattle and their insatiable appetite for grass, is lost entirely. We know they existed. We know their material culture from the tools and carvings they left behind. We know their way of life from the archaeological traces of their camps and hunting stations, but their experience of being displaced, of watching a new people claim the fjords they had known for centuries, is gone. It was never recorded because they had no writing, and the people who did have writing did not think to ask. The Thule Inuit, who arrived later, were a different matter. They were technologically sophisticated, mobile, and expansive, with a suite of cold, adapted technologies. The kayak, the umiak, the toggling harpoon, the dog sled, the snow house, that made them formidably effective in the Arctic environment. Their expansion across Arctic Canada and into Greenland was one of the great migrations of the medieval period, though it is rarely described as such in European histories. By the 13th century, the Thule were present throughout Greenland, including in areas adjacent to the Norse settlements. The relationship between the Norse and the Thule is one of the enduring puzzles of Greenlandic archaeology. The written sources, mostly Icelandic, mostly composed after the fact, describe occasional contact, mostly hostile. There are references to skirmishes, to killings, to a broad atmosphere of mutual distrust. But the archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. Norse artifacts appear at Thule sites. Thule artifacts appear rarely at Norse sites. There was trade, or at least exchange. There was observation. The Thule adopted the Norse practice of hunting with iron-tipped weapons, incorporating traded or scavenged Norse metal into their own toolkits. Whether the Norse adopted anything from the Thule, their hunting techniques, their clothing technology, their deep knowledge of the Arctic environment, is one of the most debated questions in the field. The prevailing view, supported by the evidence, though not without challenge, is that the Norse did not adapt. They did not adopt the kayak. They did not learn to build snow houses. They did not shift their diet toward the marine mammals that the Thule hunted with such efficiency. They remained across 5 centuries of Greenlandic habitation, stubbornly, fatally committed to the pastoral cattle farming church building identity they had carried from Iceland. When the climate cooled, and the pasture shrank, and the fjords iced over and the trade ships stopped coming, they did not become Inuit. They stayed Norse, and they died. But that was later. In Eric's time, the Dorset were a trace. The Thule had not yet arrived, and the fjords of the eastern settlement were, as far as the Norse were concerned, empty land waiting for the plow and the cross and the longhouse, that the land had been lived on for millennia by people whose relationship with it was older, deeper, and more sustainable than anything the Norse would achieve. This fact existed outside the frame of reference the sagas provide, and we can only hold it alongside the story of the founding without pretending the two can be reconciled. The colony grew. Farms multiplied along the fjords. Children were born. The first generation of Norse Greenlanders, people who would know no other home, for whom Iceland and Norway were stories told by their parents and grandparents, places as remote and theoretical as the Greenland that had been a rumor in Icelandic harbors a generation before. Eric presided over this growth from Bratalid with an authority that the sources depict as unquestioned but not tyrannical. He was a chieftain, not a king. He held power through precedence, through the web of obligation that the founding had created, through the simple fact that he had been first and everyone else had followed. The saga accounts of his later years at Bratalid describe a man who hosted feasts, arbitrated disputes, maintained the social bonds that held a small and isolated community together against the centrifugal forces of distance, scarcity, and the long Greenlandic dark. The dark deserves mention, because it is the one element of Greenlandic life that no amount of adaptation could mitigate. In the latitude of the eastern settlement, roughly 61 degrees north, the same latitude as Anchorage, Alaska, or the southern tip of Finland, the winter solstice brings approximately 3.5 hours of usable daylight. Not 3.5 hours of sunshine. At that latitude and season, the sun barely clears the mountains ringing the fjords. 3.5 hours of gray twilight followed by 20.5 hours of darkness, broken only by fire, oil lamp, and the occasional flare of the northern lights. The psychological toll of this is difficult to overstate and easy to overlook. Modern studies of populations at high latitudes document elevated rates of depression, sleep disruption, and seasonal affective disorder, and these are people with electric lights, heated buildings, and the knowledge that the condition is temporary and understood. The Norse Greenlanders had turf walls, seal oil lamps that gave a dim and smoky light, and the accumulated oral wisdom of their culture, which told them that winter ended eventually but offered no mechanism to make the waiting easier. They endured it. For 5 centuries, they endured it. And it would have been Eric, in those first winters when the colony was new and the turf walls were still settling and the wind from the ice cap found every gap in the construction, who set the terms of endurance. His household at Bratalid was the colony's social center, the place where men gathered to drink, to talk, to tell stories, to reaffirm the bonds that kept a small human community from flying apart in the dark. What stories did they tell? We can only guess, but the guess is informed. They would have told sagas, the long narrative histories of family feud and migration that constituted Norse literature, and that were at this point still exclusively oral, not yet committed to writing. They would have told stories of Norway and Iceland, of the landnam, of the voyages and the settlement. They would have told stories of the gods, of Dukar, of Odin and Thor and Freya, and of the old cosmology in which the world was a tree and the gods were fated to die, and even the universe itself was temporary, and they would have told the story of how they came to be there. The story of Eric, the exile, the crossing, the finding, the naming, the story that made Bratalid possible, the story that, told and retold across generations, would eventually crystallize into the sagas that we now read 300 years later in manuscripts written by Christian scribes in monasteries that Eric the pagan would not have recognized. He could not have known this. He could not have known that the stories told in his longhouse would outlast the longhouse, outlast the colony, outlast the culture that produced them. He was keeping his people together through a winter. The future would take care of itself. It usually does, though not always in the direction the living expect. It was during these early years of the colony, the late 980s and early 990s, that the event occurred which would have consequences far beyond anything Eric's Greenland settlement would achieve on its own. And characteristically, Eric was not the one who carried it out. His son did. Leif Erikson, the boy who had crossed the Atlantic on his father's ship, who had grown up at Bratalid watching the colony take shape around him, was by the mid-990s a young man of the type the sagas describe with understated approval, capable, well-built, fair-minded, with a quality the Old Norse called hofsmader, a man of moderation and good judgment. He was, in other words, everything his father was not. Where Eric was volatile, Leif was steady. Where Eric made enemies, Leif made alliances. Where Eric resolved disputes with violence, Leif appears to have resolved them, when the sources show him resolving disputes at all, with the measured calculation of a man who had watched his father's approach produce exile twice and concluded that there might be better methods. The comparison is revealing not because it flatters Leif. The sagas are not in the business of flatteries, but because it illuminates Eric. To produce a son like Leif, Eric must have maintained a household in which competence was valued, in which the skills of seamanship and negotiation and leadership were transmitted, in which the raw material of a young man's character was shaped by something more than rage. Eric was a killer, but he was not, by any evidence we possess, a bad father. The distinction matters. It is one of the many places where the simple narrative, the murderer, the exile, the brute, fails to contain the actual person. Leif's story has been told elsewhere, and at length. For our purposes, what matters is the decision point. The moment when the younger Erikson determined to sail west from Greenland, farther west than any Norse ship had gone deliberately, toward a coastline that was itself a rumor, another shape in the fog, another echo of the same pattern that had drawn Eric to Greenland. The rumor this time came from a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, an Icelandic trader who, sailing to Greenland around 985 or 986 to visit his father, had been blown off course by storms and carried southwest. Bjarni sighted land, forested coastlines low and green, utterly unlike Greenland, at 3 separate points. He did not land. This fact has baffled and frustrated historians for 1,000 years. He saw the coast of North America, possibly Labrador, possibly Newfoundland, possibly both, and he turned around and sailed to Greenland without setting foot on shore. Bjarni's priorities were not those of an explorer. He wanted to find his father. He found his father. The forests and beaches he had glimpsed from the deck of his ship were irrelevant to that purpose, and he treated them as such. But he talked about what he had seen, and the talk reached Bratalid. And at Bratalid there was a young man with his father's appetite for the unknown, and none of his father's talent for making the unknown necessary. Leif bought Bjarni's ship. The sources specify this. He purchased the actual vessel, perhaps because it had already made the crossing and proven itself in those waters, perhaps because he wanted Bjarni's crew, who knew the route, to come with it. He assembled a company of 35 men, and he went to his father. Here the sagas give us one of their most suggestive scenes, suggestive because of what it reveals about both men and about the relationship between them. Leif asked Eric to lead the expedition. This is a remarkable detail. Leif was a grown man, capable, experienced, and the instigator of the voyage. He did not need his father, but he asked Eric to come. And more than that, he asked Eric to command. The saga says Leif believed the venture would benefit from Erik's hinge, his luck, his fortune, the quality that the Norse understood not as random chance but as an inherent property of certain individuals, a spiritual magnetism that drew success toward them. Erik's hinge had found Greenland. Perhaps it would find whatever lay to the west. Erik resisted. He said he was old. He would have been in his 50s by this point. An advanced age by Norse standards, though not impossibly so. He said he could no longer endure the hardships of sea travel. But Leif pressed, and Erik relented. On the day of departure, Erik rode from Bratalid to the ship. On the way, his horse stumbled, and Erik fell. He injured his foot. The sagas say he fell and the foot was hurt, without specifying whether it was broken, sprained, or simply bruised. Erik took the fall as an omen. He said, I am not meant to discover more lands than this one we now inhabit. He turned back to Bratalid. Leif sailed without him. There are multiple ways to read this. The sagas present it as a genuine omen, the old religion's last intervention, the gods or fate or the accumulated spiritual weight of Erik's life telling him that Greenland was his portion and no more. Modern readers are tempted to see calculation, an aging man using a minor injury as a dignified excuse to avoid a voyage he had never wanted to make. Or perhaps something simpler and sadder, a father who knew that the expedition was his son's to lead, who understood that his own presence would complicate the command structure and who seized on the fall as a face-saving way to step aside. We cannot know. The sagas, as always, give us the event and withhold the interiority. Erik fell. Erik turned back. Leif sailed west. What Leif found, the coast of North America, the place he named Vinland for its grapes, or its grass, or its wine berries, depending on which etymology you accept, was the first confirmed European contact with the New World, predating Columbus by nearly 500 years. The archaeological site at Lionceau Meadows in Newfoundland, excavated by Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad in the 1960s, confirmed what the sagas had claimed. The Norse reached North America. They built structures there. They stayed at least one winter, possibly more. But they did not stay permanently. The Vinland voyages, there were several, led by different members of Erik's family over the following decade, produced exploration, temporary settlement, conflict with the indigenous population, and ultimately abandonment. The Norse came, saw, fought, and left. North America remained unknown to Europe for another 5 centuries, the contact forgotten everywhere except in the sagas and the archaeological record. Erik missed all of it. He stayed at Bratalid while his son walked on a continent. He stayed at Bratalid while his daughter Freydis sailed to Vinland and committed acts that would stain the family name. We will return to Freydis. And while his other son Thorvald sailed to Vinland and was killed there by an indigenous arrow, becoming the first known European to die in North America, the man who had sailed 900 miles into the unknown to find Greenland spent his final years watching his children sail into a further unknown and not following them. Whether this was wisdom, exhaustion, or the recognition that his particular form of luck had reached its geographical limit, the sources do not say. They show us only the consequence. Erik the Red, the founder, the exile, the man who went west, chose not to go west again. He stayed. And it was during these same years, in the late 990s, the cusp of the new millennium, that the other great disruption arrived at Bratalid. Not from the west, from the east. Not in a ship exactly, though it came by ship. It came as an idea, and the idea had a cross attached to it. Christianity reached Greenland through Leif. The precise sequence of events depends on which saga you follow. In Erik's Saga Rauda, Leif stops in Norway on his way back from Vinland, or possibly before the Vinland voyage. The chronology is disputed, and is converted to Christianity by King Olaf Tryggvason, the Norwegian monarch who had made the Christianization of the Norse world his personal project, and was pursuing it with the subtlety of a man who understood that subtlety was optional when you had an army. Olaf commissioned Leif to bring the new faith to Greenland. In Greenland saga, the conversion happens differently, but the result is the same. Leif returned to Bratalid as a Christian, carrying with him a priest, or possibly several clergy, and the expectation that the colony would convert. Most of the colony did. Theodildur, Eric's wife, converted early and enthusiastically. The sagas describe her as a willing and even eager Christian, a woman who embraced the new faith with a conviction that suggests either genuine spiritual transformation or a pragmatic recognition that Christianity was the future of Norse civilization and her family's position required alignment with it. Probably both. The sources, as always, give us the action without the interior. Eric did not convert. This is one of the few points on which both sagas and the broader tradition agree. Eric the Red remained pagan until his death. He refused baptism. He refused the new god. He continued to observe the old ways where the blots, the offerings, the cosmology of Odin and Thor, in a household and a colony that was rapidly moving away from him. Erik's Saga Rauda gives this domestic schism a specific and almost painfully human consequence. Theodhildur, the saga says, after her conversion, refused to share Eric's bed. The Old Norse is blunt. She refused him sexually. This displeased Eric greatly. The saga uses the word thungbuid, meaning it weighed heavily on him, it was a burden. The small church that Knud Krogh excavated at Bratalid, the one just over 2 meters wide, barely large enough for a few dozen worshippers, built of turf and stone, at a slight distance from the main longhouse, is, according to the saga tradition, Theodhildur's church. She had it built. Eric did not want it. She built it anyway, at a remove from the farmstead, far enough that Eric would not have to look at it directly from his door, but close enough that everyone knew it was there, that his wife prayed to a god he rejected, that the world was changing around him and he would not change with it. The archaeology does not tell us whether Eric was angry, but it confirms the church. It confirms the separation, the physical distance between the church and the longhouse, the statement embedded in that distance, and it confirms the period. The church dates to approximately the year 1000, give or take a decade. The timing aligns with the saga account. Theodhildur built her church. Eric fumed. The colony converted. The old man held his ground. There is something almost unbearably human about this image. The founder of the colony, the man who named the land, who organized the migration, who built Bratalid with his own scarred hands, sitting in his longhouse while his wife prays in a building he did not sanction to a god he does not acknowledge, while his children sail to lands he will not see, while the world he made begins to outgrow him. He had not been thrown out this time. He had been left behind. And perhaps for a man like Eric, that was worse. We should talk about Freydis. Freydis, Eric's daughter. Eric's daughter, Leif's half-sister, born to Eric by a woman who was not Theodhildur, and whose name the sources either never recorded or did not preserve. Freydis appears in the saga record as a figure of considerable force and, in one account, considerable horror. And her story is relevant here because she is the most vivid evidence that whatever quality made Eric dangerous did not dissipate in a single generation. The two sagas tell different stories about Freydis, and the divergence is significant. In Greenland saga, the older, generally more trusted account, Freydis participates in one of the Vinland expeditions, traveling west with a party of Icelandic brothers named Helgi and Finnbogi, with whom she has entered into a business partnership. The arrangement sours. Freydis, through a combination of manipulation and accusation, she tells her husband Thorvard that the brothers have beaten her, a claim the saga strongly implies is fabricated, incites a massacre. The Icelandic brothers and their men are killed, and then Freydis, when the men refuse to kill the women in the brothers' party, takes up an axe and does it herself. The saga describes this with characteristic restraint. She killed 5 women. She killed them with an axe. The men with her stood and watched because no one would do it for her. In Erik's Saga Rauda, Freydis appears in a different Vinland episode. The Norse camp is attacked by Skraelingar, Indigenous people, and the men flee in panic. Freydis, pregnant and apparently fearless, emerges from her shelter, picks up a sword from a fallen man, bares her breast, and slaps the flat of the blade against it, screaming at the attackers. The Skraelingar withdraw. Freydis stands her ground. The two accounts are usually read as independent traditions, one possibly historical, the other possibly literary elaboration, neither entirely reliable. But taken together, they paint a portrait of a woman who was, by any measure, formidable, violent, and willing to act in ways that exceeded even the broad boundaries of permissible female agency in Norse society. She is, in the most literal sense, her father's daughter. The Freydis massacre, if it happened, if the Grenlandinga saga account is approximately accurate, is the darkest episode in the history of Eric's family. It is the point where the energy that drove Eric west, that founded Greenland, that sent Leif to Vinland, turns purely destructive. Freydis does not build anything. She does not find anything. She kills people who were her partners and trading companions, apparently out of greed and the willingness to use violence as a shortcut to advantage. Leif, when he learned of it, according to the saga, was horrified but refused to punish his sister. He said her descendants would suffer for what she had done, and he let her go. The saga says that from that time on, no one thought well of Freydis or her family. Whether Eric knew about Freydis's actions in Vinland is unclear. The chronology is uncertain, and Eric may have been dead before the specific voyage in question. But the bloodline is the point. Eric's violence begat a colony. Freydis's violence begat a massacre. The same capacity, the same refusal to be constrained, the same willingness to act when others hesitated, produced in one generation a settlement, and in the next, an atrocity. This is not a moral lesson. The sagas do not draw one, and we should be cautious about drawing one for them. It is a pattern, and patterns in the saga literature are offered for contemplation, not judgment. Eric was violent. His daughter was violent. The violence that the frontier rewarded was not, once the frontier was settled, easily contained. The sagas saw this. We should see it too, and then set it down without pretending it resolves into something clean. Eric the Red died at Bratalid. The sources disagree on the date and the cause. The most commonly accepted date is approximately 1003, though some scholars place it a year or two earlier or later. The cause, according to Erik's Saga Rauda, was disease, an epidemic that struck the colony in its early years, killing many of the original settlers. The saga does not specify the disease. In a community without physicians, without diagnostic frameworks, and without written medical records, a disease was simply a dying. People fell ill, people died, and the survivors buried them and continued. If the epidemic account is accurate, and there is no strong reason to doubt it, though no archaeological confirmation has been found either, then Eric died not in violence, not in a blaze of saga-worthy combat, but in bed, feverish, surrounded by the turf walls he had raised and the community he had built, taken by something microscopic and indifferent to his reputation. He was approximately 55 years old. He had been born in Norway, raised in Iceland, exiled from both, and had spent the last 18 or 20 years of his life in the country he had found and named and filled with people. He died pagan in a colony that was turning Christian. He died a founder whose children had already surpassed him. Leif by reaching a continent Eric never saw. Freydis by committing acts that made Eric's own violence look measured by comparison. The sagas note his death and move on. There is no eulogy, no extended lament, no scene of deathbed wisdom or reconciliation. Eric dies and the narrative continues to Vinland, to the colony's ongoing story, to the events that the saga writers, 3 centuries later, found more interesting than the death of an old man in a turf house. This is how the sagas work. They are not sentimental. They record. The great and the small received the same terse treatment. He died, the next thing happened. But we can pause where the sagas do not. Eric the Red was buried at Bratalid. The exact location of his grave is unknown. Krog's excavations uncovered a small Norse graveyard near Thjóðhildur's church, containing the remains of approximately 150 individuals, many of them from the colony's first generations. Eric may be among them, or he may have been buried elsewhere, away from the church his wife built for a god he rejected, in ground that was not consecrated because he had refused consecration. We do not know. The ground does not speak his name. What Eric left behind was larger than a farm, larger than a family, and more durable than any single human life has a right to expect. The Greenland colony survived Eric by nearly 500 years. 5 centuries of continuous Norse habitation at the western edge of the known world, sustained by the combination of farming, hunting, and trade that the founding generation established and every subsequent generation struggled to maintain. It was, for most of its existence, the most remote European outpost on the planet, farther from any other Christian community than any monastery, any crusader castle, any Hanseatic trading post. The colony grew. By the 12th century, the eastern settlement contained approximately 190 farms, the western settlement roughly 90. The total population probably peaked somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people, though estimates vary and the data is thin. They built 16 churches in the eastern settlement alone, including a small cathedral at Gardar, modern Igaliku, that was the seat of a bishop appointed by the Archbishop of Nidaros in Norway. The first Greenlandic bishop, Arnaldur, arrived in 1126. The Greenlandic Church was, for several centuries, a functioning diocese of the Catholic Church, paying tithes, sending reports, receiving correspondence, participating in the institutional life of medieval Christendom from a position so remote that letters took years to arrive, and papal bulls were sometimes obsolete before they could be read. They carved rune stones. They illuminated manuscripts, or at least they possessed them, imported from Iceland and Norway. They traded walrus ivory and polar bear pelts for communion wine and church bells and the iron that their island could not provide. They married, feuded, litigated, sinned, repented, and died in the rhythms that characterized every medieval European community, differing from their continental counterparts primarily in the extremity of their environment and the thinness of their margin. And then they disappeared. The western settlement was abandoned first, probably in the mid-14th century. A Norwegian cleric named Ivar Bardarson, sent to Greenland to inspect church properties, reported visiting the western settlement and finding it empty. No people, only feral cattle and sheep wandering the abandoned farms. The eastern settlement held longer. The last written record of events in the Norse Greenland settlement is a marriage recorded at Valsey Church in 1408, a wedding, attended by witnesses, documented in the Icelandic annals, the final bureaucratic trace of a civilization that had been dying for a century. After 1408, silence. No more records, no more ships, no more communication. The colony that Eric had founded vanished from the historical record as completely as if the ice had closed over it, which in a sense it had. The reasons for the colony's extinction have been debated for decades, and no single cause suffices. The climate deteriorated. The medieval warm period ended, replaced by the cooling trend known as the Little Ice Age, which shortened growing seasons, expanded sea ice, choked the fjords with pack ice that made navigation progressively more difficult. The pasture shrank. The hay harvest failed. The cattle died. The trade dried up. Elephant ivory imported to Europe from Africa undercut the market for walrus tusks. The Norwegian merchants who had maintained the sea link to Greenland found less reason to make the voyage. Ships came less often, then rarely, then not at all. The colony, dependent on imported iron, timber, and grain, was slowly starved of the materials it could not produce for itself. The Thule Inuit expanded southward, occupying territory that had once been Norse hunting grounds. Whether there was violent conflict, peaceful coexistence, absorption, or simply parallel decline is still debated. The Norse sources by this point were not being written. The Inuit oral tradition suggests some contact, some knowledge of the Norse, but details are fragmentary, and the Norse Greenlanders themselves may have made choices, or failed to make them, that sealed their fate. They did not adopt Inuit technology. They did not learn to hunt from kayaks, to build igloos, to use dog sleds. They did not shift their diet decisively toward marine mammals in the way that would have been necessary to survive as the pastoral economy collapsed. They clung to the identity they had carried across the Atlantic, Norse, Christian, pastoral, European, an identity that had built the colony and that, when the conditions that sustained it changed, could not adapt fast enough to save it. The bones tell the story. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains from the later settlement period shows a population increasingly dependent on seal, the marine protein signature in their bones rising steadily across the centuries, but never fully committed to the marine economy that might have sustained them. They ate seal, but they did not become seal hunters in the way the Inuit were seal hunters. They adapted halfway. Halfway was not enough. The last Norse Greenlanders died sometime in the 15th century. We do not know the exact year. We do not know the exact circumstances. We do not know if the final survivors understood that they were the last. If they knew that no ship would come, that no one in Iceland or Norway remembered them, that the colony their grandfather's grandfather had built was ending not in fire or conquest, but in a slow, cold contraction toward nothing. They are gone. The ruins remain. The turf walls have collapsed into grassy mounds. The churches are roofless shells. The farmsteads are outlines in the soil, visible from the air as faint geometric patterns in the vegetation. The ghosts of property lines, of hay fields, of the boundaries that once separated one family's land from another's. Bratalid is there. You can walk to it. You can stand where Erik's longhouse stood at the head of the fjord he named after himself, and look out over water that is blacker and colder and more often frozen than it was 1,000 years ago. You can see the outline of Theodildur's church, reconstructed now. A tiny turf chapel barely large enough to hold a prayer. The wind is the same. That has not changed. Erik the Red did not live to see any of this. He did not live to see the churches multiply, did not live to see the bishop's seat established at Gardar, did not live to see the walrus ivory trade reach its peak or begin its long decline. He died in the first decade of the 11th century when the colony was still raw, still finding its shape, still closer to a frontier encampment than to the functioning medieval society it would become. He built the foundation, others built the house. And the house, as we have seen, eventually fell. But there is a danger in telling Erik's story backward from the colony's end, in reading the extinction into the founding, in treating the 5 centuries of Greenlandic habitation as a long prelude to failure. The colony did not feel like a prelude to the people who lived in it. It felt like a life. It felt like home. And for the better part of 500 years, it worked. Not easily, not comfortably, not without cost, but it worked in the way that human communities work when the people in them are determined enough and the environment is not yet impossible. Erik made that possible. The question is what to do with that fact. Why? Let us return to the man himself, stripped of the colony's afterlife, stripped of the son's fame, stripped of the daughter's infamy, stripped of the 5 centuries of consequence that followed his death. Let us look at Erik Thorvaldsson as he was in the years he actually lived, the 50-odd years between his birth in Rogaland and his death at Bratalid, and ask what kind of person we are actually dealing with. The sources give us actions. They do not give us motives. They do not give us interiority. We have no letters, no diary, no recorded speech beyond the handful of sentences the sagas place in his mouth, each of which was composed 2 centuries after his death by a writer who was constructing a character, not transcribing a man. We have a silhouette. We have a trajectory. We have the pattern of choices that a life observed from sufficient distance resolves into. The pattern is this: confrontation, escalation, expulsion, migration, repetition. Erik confronted Eyjolf the Foul and killed him. He confronted Thorgest and killed his sons. He was expelled from the Haukadalr district. He was expelled from Iceland. He migrated to Greenland. In Greenland, the pattern did not repeat. Or rather, it could not repeat, because there was nowhere farther west to go, no authority to expel him, no social structure he had not himself created. The pattern terminated not because Erik changed, but because the geography ran out. This is the reading that the narrative invites. Eric, as a man of fixed temperament placed in a series of environments, destructive in each one until he found the one environment, empty land, no existing social order, no rivals, where his temperament became constructive rather than corrosive. It is a tidy reading. It has the shape of a parable. The exile finds his purpose. The misfit finds his niche. The square peg, having smashed through a succession of round holes, finally discovers a square one. It may even be correct, but we should be cautious about its tidiness, because the sources that give us this pattern were themselves composed by writers who understood narrative shape, who knew how to construct a character arc, and who may have simplified the actual messiness of Eric's life into a trajectory that their audience would find satisfying. The sagas are literature, not transcription. They select, compress, and arrange. The Eric we receive is the Eric that survived the process of storytelling, and the storytelling had its own purposes. What can we say with reasonable confidence? We can say he was violent. The killings are attested in multiple sources, and there is no reason to doubt them. Norse Icelandic society was violent by modern standards, and the saga corpus is essentially a literature of feud. But even by those standards, Eric accumulated a body count and a legal record that placed him at the extreme end of the distribution. Most Icelanders lived their entire lives without killing anyone. Most of those who killed did so once, in a single feud, and then submitted to the legal process of compensation and reconciliation. Eric killed repeatedly in multiple feuds, and the legal system's response, escalating from local banishment to national banishment, suggests a community that had exhausted its mechanisms for containing him. We can say he was capable. The Greenland venture was not a blind lunge into the dark. It was planned, executed, and followed up with a recruitment campaign that persuaded hundreds of people to uproot their lives. This requires organizational skill, logistical competence, and the ability to inspire confidence, to stand in front of people who know your reputation and persuade them that following you across the North Atlantic is a better option than staying where they are. Eric did this. He did it successfully enough that 25 ships launched, and he did it honestly enough, or persuasively enough, that the people who arrived and found ice rather than green did not immediately turn around and go home. We can say he was stubborn. The refusal to convert to Christianity, maintained against the pressure of his wife, his son, and the entire trajectory of Norse civilization, speaks to a rigidity that is either admirable or pathological depending on your perspective. Eric held to the old gods when everyone around him was abandoning them. He held to his own authority when the cultural ground was shifting beneath him. He held, in the end, to being Eric, the man he had always been, the man the frontier had rewarded, the man who had found his country by being too difficult for any other country to keep. We can say he was lucky. Not in the mystical sense the sagas intend when they speak of Hinge, but in the material sense, he arrived in Greenland during the medieval warm period when the fjords were at their most habitable and the pasture at its most productive. Had he arrived 2 centuries later, the ice would have been worse, the grass thinner, the margin non-existent. His timing was a gift from the climate, and he could not have known he was receiving it. And we can say, though this requires more inference than the other claims, that he was shrewd. The naming of Greenland is the most obvious evidence, but the shrewdness extends beyond branding. Eric chose the best site in the colony for himself. He positioned Bratalid at the head of the most productive fjord, ensuring that his farm would be the wealthiest and most strategically located in the settlement. He organized the distribution of land in a way that placed himself at the center of a web of obligation. Every settler who received a farm from Eric owed him a debt that could be called upon in labor, in loyalty, in political support. He was, in modern terms, a developer who sold the lots and kept the best one, a franchise operator who controlled the brand. Whether this constitutes genius or merely competence is a matter of definition. Eric did not invent anything. He did not discover Greenland. Gunnbjörn had cited it decades earlier. He did not develop new technologies or new ideas. What he did was recognize an opportunity that no one else had been desperate enough to pursue, and he pursued it with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that survival at the edge of the world required not just courage, but logistics. This is the trait the style profile calls pragmatism as genius, and it applies to Eric as precisely as it applies to anyone in the saga record. Eric was not a visionary. He was a planner. He was not an idealist. He was a realist who happened to be operating in conditions so extreme that realism looked like audacity. He saw the fjords and calculated the hay yield. He saw the walrus beaches and calculated the ivory revenue. He saw the isolation and calculated the political advantage. And he was right in every case about what the land could sustain and what it could offer, at least for the span of his own lifetime and a few generations beyond it. That the calculation eventually failed, that the colony he founded died, does not retroactively invalidate it. Eric did not promise permanence. He promised land. He delivered. There is a broader question embedded in Eric's story, one that the saga writers did not ask because it was not available to them, but that we, standing 1,000 years later with the full arc of the colony's history visible, cannot avoid. The question is this: what does it mean to found a civilization that fails? Western history has a deep bias toward permanence. We measure civilizations by duration. Rome endures, therefore Rome matters. The empires that lasted are the empires we study. The settlements that survived become the ancestors we claim. The ones that didn't, the ones that rose and held and then contracted and vanished, are treated as footnotes, as curiosities, as failed experiments whose failure constitutes their primary meaning. By this standard, Eric's Greenland is a failure. It lasted 5 centuries, and then it ended. It produced no enduring state, no continuous lineage of habitation, no legacy that the modern inhabitants of Greenland, the Inuit, whose ancestors arrived separately and survived where the Norse did not, would recognize as their inheritance. The Norse Greenlanders built churches that no one prays in. They carved runestones that no one reads in the language they were written in. They raised cattle in fields that have returned to scrub. Their DNA persists, perhaps, in trace amounts in the Icelandic population, carried back by the last emigrants, but their community is gone as thoroughly as if it had never existed, and yet. 5 centuries is not nothing. 5 centuries is longer than the United States has existed. It is longer than the entire colonial and post-colonial history of the Americas. It is longer than the Ottoman Empire's presence in southeastern Europe. It is longer than English has been spoken in its modern form. 5 centuries of continuous habitation, of births and deaths, of marriages and feuds and harvests and hunts, of children growing up in a landscape their great-great-great-grandparents had settled. This is not a failure. Or if it is a failure that contained within it more human life, more human experience, more human meaning than most successes. The question may be wrongly framed. Perhaps the distinction between endurance and extinction is less meaningful than we assume. Every human community is temporary. Rome fell. The Maya cities emptied. The great empires of West Africa rose and fragmented and rose again in different forms. Even the communities that appear permanent are only permanent from the vantage of a short-lived observer who cannot see far enough ahead to watch them end. Greenland's Norse colony lasted 5 centuries and vanished. Most human ventures last far less and vanish far more completely. Eric could not have thought in these terms. He was founding a settlement, not a civilization. He was solving a personal problem, exile, landlessness, the need for a place where he could live without someone trying to legally or physically kill him. And the solution happened to involve transporting several hundred people across the North Atlantic to an island covered in ice. The civilizational consequences were incidental. They always are. The people who found things rarely understand what they are founding. The people who build things rarely see the building's final shape. This is one of the deep ironies of the settlement of Greenland. The man who organized it was thinking in terms of years, not centuries. He needed 3 years of exile to pass. He needed a place to ride them out. The place he found sustained human life for 500 years, and then it didn't. And both facts, the sustaining and the ending, are part of his legacy, though he was responsible for neither in any direct sense. He put people there. What happened after was weather, economics, biology, and the accumulated choices of 50 generations of people whose names he would never know. The colony Eric built outlived him, but it did not forget him. His name persisted in the landscape, Eriksfjordur, Eriksøy, Bratalid, and in the genealogies that the Greenlanders maintained with the same obsessive care that characterized all Norse societies. To be able to name your ancestors, to locate yourself within a chain of descent that stretched back to the founding, was to possess the most fundamental form of social capital in the medieval Norse world. Eric was the anchor of every Greenlandic genealogy. He was the beginning of the story that every Greenlandic family told about itself. And the stories traveled. They traveled back to Iceland on the same ships that carried walrus ivory and polar bear pelts, carried in the mouths of traders and travelers who wintered in Icelandic farmsteads and told tales of the western colony over long, dark evenings. They accumulated. They accreted. They gathered the embellishments and refinements and structural shapings that oral narrative always gathers, and sometime in the 13th century, they were written down. The sagas are the final form of this process, the crystallization point where oral tradition becomes text, where memory becomes literature, where the accumulated tellings of 200 years collapse into a manuscript that a monk copies by candlelight in a scriptorium that Eric the pagan could not have imagined. The transition from mouth to page is not a neutral act. It filters, it selects. The saga writers were Christians writing about pagans. They were Icelanders writing about Greenlanders. They were literate men recording the traditions of an oral culture. At every stage, the material was shaped by the distance between the recorder and the recorded. This matters because our Eric, the Eric of this script, the Eric of popular history, the Eric of the documentaries and the children's books and the postage stamps, is the saga Eric. And the saga Eric is a literary construction built on an oral tradition built on a life. The life is inaccessible. The oral tradition is gone. What remains is the text, and the text is honest about some things and dishonest about others and silent about most. The sagas are honest about Eric's violence. They do not soften it, do not excuse it, do not frame it as reluctant or righteous. He killed people. The sagas say so plainly and move on. This is one of the virtues of the saga style. Its refusal to moralize allows the facts to retain their weight. A modern biography might spend pages analyzing Eric's psychological state, his childhood trauma, the social pressures that produced his aggression. The sagas say, he killed Eyjolf the Foul. They say, he killed Thorgest's sons. They let the killing stand as facts, as solid and unpsychologized as the volcanic rock of the Icelandic shore. The sagas are less honest and are less interested in honesty reading. About Eric's interior life, his motives, his emotional landscape. They give us the horse stumbling, Eric turning back, the single sentence about fate. They give us Theodildur refusing his bed and Eric finding it heavy. These are gestures toward interiority, not interiority itself. They are the gaps where a modern writer might insert a paragraph of psychological analysis, and a saga writer inserts silence, trusting the audience to fill the space with their own understanding of what it means to be old, to be stubborn, to be left behind. The sagas are dishonest, or at least strategic, about the naming of Greenland. The claim that Eric chose the name to attract settlers is presented as a simple fact, but it is also a narrative device. It makes Eric clever. It makes the story satisfying. It provides the paradox that every retelling of Eric's life, including this one, deploys as a hook. The man who named an ice sheet green. Whether Eric actually articulated this rationale or whether the saga writer attributed it to him as a retroactive explanation for a name whose actual origin may have been simpler or more complicated is unknowable. The saga gives us the version that makes the best story. This is what sagas do. And the sagas are silent. systematically, structurally silent about the people who were already there. The Dorset traces that Eric found during his exploration are mentioned in passing, noted as evidence that the land had been inhabited, and then abandoned as a narrative thread. The people who left those traces are not named, not described, not considered as having any relationship to the land that Eric might need to acknowledge or negotiate. They are artifacts, not agents. They are traces, not people. This silence is not accidental. It is constitutive. The saga narrative of Greenland's founding requires the land to be empty. Not literally empty, since the traces are mentioned, but narratively empty, available, unclaimed in any way that the Norse framework recognizes as a claim. The Dorset had no farms. They had no longhouses. They had no livestock, no hay, no property boundaries visible to Norse eyes. Therefore they had no claim. Therefore the land was Eric's to take. We have named this silence before, in the earlier sections of this script, and we will not fill it now because it cannot be filled. The Dorset perspective on the Norse arrival is lost. The Thule perspective, which came later, is partially recoverable through oral tradition but was not recorded contemporaneously and cannot be mapped onto the specific events of Eric's founding. What we can do is hold the silence alongside the narrative, note its presence, note its shape, note that the story we are telling is a story told entirely from one side of a contact that had two. The silence does not invalidate the story, but it does condition it. It reminds us that the founding of Greenland was, like every founding, also a claiming, a declaration that this land belongs to us now, spoken over the heads of people who had known it longer and known it differently, and who did not have saga writers to record their objection. There is one more dimension of Eric's legacy that requires attention, and it is the one that has given his story its longest afterlife: his son. Leif Eriksons' voyage to Vinland, to North America, is the event for which Eric's family is primarily remembered in modern popular culture. It is the reason there is a Leif Erikson Day in the United States. It is the reason the Icelandic sagas are taught in North American schools. It is the reason the name Erikson carries a resonance out of all proportion to what was, in historical terms, a failed colonization attempt that produced no lasting settlement. And it is Eric's legacy in a precise and specific sense. Without Eric, there is no Leif. Without Greenland, there is no Vinland. Without the exile that drove Eric west, there is no westward-facing community from which a further westward voyage could be launched. The Greenland colony was the staging ground, the platform, the necessary precondition. Columbus sailed from Spain. Leif sailed from Bratalid. And Bratalid existed because a man with a bad temper and a worse legal record had nowhere else to put it. The chain of causation runs: Thorvald kills a man in Norway. Thorvald is exiled to Iceland. Eric grows up marginal and angry. Eric kills men in Iceland. Eric is exiled to Greenland. Eric settles Greenland. Leif grows up in Greenland. Leif sails west. Europeans reach North America. Every link is contingent. Remove anyone, and the chain breaks. If Thorvald had settled his dispute in Norway without violence, if Eric had accepted compensation for his thralls instead of killing Eyjolf, if Thorgest had returned the high seat pillars, if the Althing had sentenced Eric to full outlawry rather than lesser outlawry, stripping his right to return and removing his incentive to prospect for future settlers, if the horse had not stumbled and Eric had sailed with Leif to Vinland and died there, and no one had returned to Greenland to maintain the colony, any of these, all of these, the history of European contact with North America hangs on a chain of decisions made by angry men in a volcanic island in the North Atlantic, adjudicated by an assembly of farmers meeting on a rift valley, and carried forward by a series of ocean crossings in open boats with no compass, no chart, and no guarantee of arrival. This is what contingency looks like in practice, not the grand contingency of empires and ideologies, but the small contingency of a landslide caused by thralls, a set of high seat pillars not returned, a horse's stumble on a path to the harbor. History's hinge points are rarely visible to the people standing on them. Eric stood on one. He did not know it. He was solving a problem. The solution echoed for 1,000 years. We are now, in a sense, living inside that echo. The modern rediscovery of the Norse presence in North America, the chain of scholarship, archaeology, and public fascination that connects the saga texts to the excavation at L'Anse aux Meadows to the broader reassessment of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact runs through Eric. It runs through Greenland. It runs through the colony that served as the bridge between the old world and the new, the stepping stone that made the crossing conceivable and the return possible. The L'Anse aux Meadows site, excavated by Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad beginning in 1960, provided the physical confirmation that the saga accounts of Vinland were not merely literary invention. The site, located on the northern tip of Newfoundland, contained the remains of 8 Norse-type turf buildings, a smithy with iron slag, bronze cloak pins, a spindle whorl, artifacts that were unmistakably Norse and unmistakably dated to approximately the year 1000. The site was occupied briefly, perhaps a few years, perhaps a single winter. It was a base camp, not a colony. But it was real, and its reality retroactively validated the entire saga tradition that described it. And that tradition begins with Eric. The Vinland sagas are not called the Vinland sagas because Vinland is their only subject. They are called the Vinland sagas because Vinland is their climax in Escalating, the farthest point of the westward reach that began with Eric's father leaving Norway, continued with Erik leaving Iceland, and culminated with Leif leaving Greenland. The sagas understand this. They structure themselves as multi-generational narratives of westward migration, each generation pushing farther, each generation discovering and failing to hold a new territory, each generation producing the conditions from which the next generation launches. Eric is the pivot. He is the generation that makes the final push possible. Without his Greenland, the distance from Iceland to North America, over 2,000 nautical miles of open Atlantic, is too far for a single crossing in a Norse vessel. With Greenland, the distance shrinks to something manageable, roughly 600 miles from the western settlement to Baffin Island, with the Labrador coast visible from the Greenlandic shore on clear days and the currents running favorably southwest. Greenland is the bridge. Eric built the bridge, and then his son walked across it. This is Eric's deepest contribution, and it is the one he was least equipped to understand. He did not found Greenland so that his son could discover North America. He founded Greenland because he had been thrown out of Iceland and had nowhere else to go. The continental consequences were, from his perspective, invisible. He was surviving. He was solving the immediate problem of his own exile. The fact that his solution positioned a Norse community within sailing distance of a continent that no European knew existed was an accident of geography, not an act of foresight. But accidents of geography are how history works. The Mediterranean is narrow, and therefore Rome and Carthage collided. The English Channel is wide enough to stop armies and narrow enough to invite crossing, and therefore England developed differently from France. The Denmark Strait is 900 miles of cold water, and therefore Iceland was the last Norse colony before the edge of the world, until Eric crossed it and moved the edge. He could not have known what he was moving it toward. He was keeping his family alive. He was maintaining his position. He was doing the thing that human beings do when the familiar ground is taken from them. He was looking for new ground and finding it and standing on it and saying, "This is mine now," with no more cosmic awareness than a man planting a fence post. The fence post held. For 500 years, the fence post held. And from that fence post, his children looked farther west and saw another shore. There is a temptation, at this point in the narrative, to draw the line clean, to present Eric as a visionary who saw what others could not, a pioneer whose violence was the necessary cost of his greatness, a founder whose flaws were inseparable from his achievements. This is the version of the story that statues are built for. It is the version that names streets and holidays and ships. It is the version that collapses the moral complexity of a human life into a monument. We should resist it. Eric was not a visionary. He was a pragmatist operating under extreme constraint. He did not see farther than other men, he had fewer options than other men, and the option he chose happened to produce extraordinary results. The results do not retroactively ennoble the circumstances. A man who founded a colony because he had been exiled for killing people is not a hero. He is a founder who was also a killer, and the two facts exist in the same body without reconciling. The sagas understood this. They do not celebrate Eric. They do not condemn him. They record him, his killings, his exile, his founding, his stubbornness, his refusal to convert, his death by epidemic in the house he'd built at the head of the fjord he named after himself. They give him no final speech, no moment of wisdom, no reconciliation with his wife or his God or his fate. He simply ends, as all saga characters end, with the narrative moving past him toward the next event. This is perhaps the most honest form of legacy available. Not the monument, not the myth, the record. The plain, unadorned statement of what a person did, set down without judgment, preserved without commentary, offered to the future as raw material for whatever meaning the future chooses to make of it. We are the future. We are making meaning now. And the meaning we make should be large enough to hold the whole man of the killer and the founder, the exile and the patriarch, the pagan and the father of Christians, the man who named ice green and convinced people to believe him. The contradictions do not resolve. They are not meant to. They are the shape of a life lived at the edge of what was possible, in a time when the edge was geographical and the cost of reaching it was measured in bodies. Eric paid the cost. Others paid it for him. The 11 ships that sank on the crossing to Greenland paid it. The thralls who labored at Bratalid paid it. The Dorset whose land was claimed without consultation paid it. Eyolf the foul paid it. Thorgest's sons paid it. The ledger does not balance. It never does. History is not an accounting exercise. It is the accumulation of choices and consequences that resist summation, that refuse the clean line, that insist on being held in their full, uncomfortable complexity. Hold them. That is all the sources ask of us. Hold the man and his deeds and his consequences together without dropping any of them, and see what shape emerges. The shape is Eric. Red-haired, thick-shouldered, standing on a shore that is not the shore he was born on, looking west at a country he claimed because no one could stop him. The wind off the ice cap pressed against his back. The grass bent. The water shivered. He had work to do. The work was never finished. That was the nature of life at the edge of the habitable world. Not a single heroic effort, but a grinding daily negotiation with an environment that offered survival but never comfort, that permitted human presence but never endorsed it. To understand what Eric built, and what the generations after him sustained, we need to descend from the narrative of founding and settlement into the texture of daily life in the Greenland colony, into the material reality of what it meant, day by day and season by season, to be Norse in a place the Norse body was not designed for. Begin with the calendar. The Greenlandic year was not divided into 4 seasons in the way a temperate European would understand them. It was divided into 2, the light and the dark. From late April to mid-September, the sun was present, low on the horizon in the shoulder months, but present, flooding the fjords with the pale gold light that made the grass grow and the livestock fatten and the hunters paddle north toward the walrus grounds. From mid-September to late April, the darkness accumulated, thickening through October and November until the winter solstice crushed the day to a sliver, and the only illumination came from seal oil lamps, the hearth fire, and the faint greenish shimmer of the aurora overhead. The rhythm of work followed the light. Summer was frantic. Every hour of daylight was a resource to be spent, and the spending could not be deferred. Hay had to be cut, dried, and stored. Fish had to be caught and preserved. Split, salted where salt was available, wind-dried on wooden racks where it was not. Seal had to be hunted in the fjords during the spring pupping season, when the animals were most accessible and the fat was thickest. Driftwood had to be collected from the beaches. Greenland had no native timber large enough for construction, and the wood that washed ashore from Siberian rivers carried across the Arctic Ocean by currents that took years to complete the circuit was one of the colony's most precious resources. Every beam in every building, every ship's plank, every tool handle that was not imported from Norway at enormous cost was driftwood, gathered and hoarded with the care that a desert society reserves for water. The Nordorseda expeditions departed in summer, June or July, when the sea ice retreated enough to allow passage up the western coast. The hunting parties were small, perhaps 10 to 20 men in open boats, and they were gone for weeks, sometimes months, pushing north past the Arctic Circle to Disco Bay and beyond, to the beaches where the Atlantic walrus hauled out in their hundreds and thousands. The hunt itself was brutal work, approaching the massive animals in small boats, harpooning them in the shallows or on the beaches, butchering the carcasses on site and loading the tusks and hides for the return voyage. A bull walrus weighs over a ton and can move faster than a man on land for short distances. The tusks that European carvers turned into chess pieces and crucifix panels were extracted from animals that had to be killed at close range by men in open boats in Arctic waters with hand-thrown weapons. The ivory was wealth. But it was a specific kind of wealth, portable, durable, and valuable only to the extent that someone could be found to buy it. The Nordorseda hunters brought the tusks south to the settlements. The tusks were stored, accumulated, and then loaded onto the ships that made the annual or biannual voyage to Norway, the trade vessels that constituted the colony's lifeline to the outside world. Without those ships, the ivory was just bone. Without the ivory, the ships had no reason to come. The entire economy turned on this exchange, this annual transaction between a colony that produced luxury goods and a metropole that produced necessities. It was a relationship of mutual dependence that looked from the outside like a functioning trade system, and was from the inside a condition of permanent vulnerability. Because the ships did not always come, the distance from Bergen to the eastern settlement, roughly 2,500 nautical miles via the standard route through Iceland, was enormous by medieval standards. The voyage took 4 to 6 weeks in favorable conditions, longer in foul weather, and favorable conditions in the North Atlantic was a relative term that admitted of considerable misery. The ships that made the crossing were Nars, broad-beamed cargo vessels designed for open ocean sailing, clinker built from overlapping oak planks with a single square sail and a shallow enough draft to be beached on arrival. They were good ships. They were not safe ships. The North Atlantic in any season is a place of deep swells, sudden storms, fog that persists for days, and currents that can push a vessel hundreds of miles off course. Ships were lost on the Greenland route with sufficient regularity that the crossing was understood by everyone who made it as a genuine gamble. When a ship did arrive, nosing into the fjord at Bratalid or one of the other eastern settlement harbors, its sail visible from miles away, its hull riding low with cargo. The event was a communal occasion of considerable intensity. The ship brought iron, which the colony could not smelt. It brought timber, which the colony could not grow. It brought grain, barley, rye, which the colony could grow only in tiny quantities in the best years and not at all in the worst. It brought news. Who had died in Iceland? Who had married? What the King of Norway was doing, what the Pope had decreed, what was happening in the world beyond the horizon. And it brought objects that were not strictly necessary, but that connected the colony to the civilization it claimed membership in: church bells, stained glass, communion wine, books, vestments, the material apparatus of medieval Christianity that the Greenlandic diocese required in order to function as a diocese, and not merely as a collection of people who happened to pray. The ship also took things away, not just ivory and hides and the other trade goods, but also people. Young Greenlanders sailed east to Iceland and Norway for education, for adventure, for marriage, for the simple human need to see a place that was not the place they had been born. Some returned, some did not. The colony's gene pool was never large, and every departure was a subtraction from a community that could not easily afford subtraction. This was the pulse of the colony's year. The frantic summer of work and harvest and hunting, the long dark winter of endurance and waiting, and threaded through both, the question that hung over every season. Would the ship come? Would the trade hold? Would the thread connecting this tiny community to the vast body of European civilization remain unbroken for another year? For most of the colony's life, the thread held. We should speak of the church because the church became, in the generations after Eric's death, the colony's most powerful institution and its most visible connection to the world beyond the fjords. Eric had died pagan. His wife had built the first church. His son Leif had brought the first priest. Within 2 generations, Christianity was not merely present in Greenland, but dominant. The organizing framework for social life, the calendar that structured the year, the institution that owned more land and livestock than any single farmer and wielded an authority that the secular chieftains could contest but not ignore. The Greenlandic Church was formally established as a diocese in 1124, when the Norwegian king Sigurd Jorsalfar and the Archbishop of Lund agreed to appoint a bishop for the colony. The first bishop, Arnaldur, arrived in 1126 and established his seat at Gardar in modern Igaliku, a site in the inner reaches of one of the eastern settlement's most productive fjords. Gardar became the ecclesiastical center of the colony, a cathedral church, a bishop's residence, farm buildings, and a great hall for the assembly of the faithful. The cathedral was, by Greenlandic standards, substantial. Stone and turf construction, roughly 27 meters long, with a chancel and a nave and glass windows imported from Europe. By the standards of any European diocese, it was tiny. By the standards of a community of 4,000 people clinging to a strip of coast between an ice cap and the sea, it was a statement of extraordinary ambition. The bishops came from Norway. They were appointed by the archbishop, not elected by the Greenlanders, and they served as both spiritual leaders and political authorities, representing the Norwegian crown's claim to sovereignty over the colony. The relationship between the bishops and the local chieftains was, as in every medieval European community, a negotiation, a continuous low-grade struggle over land, tithes, labor, and the boundaries of secular and ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The church accumulated property. Farms were donated by the pious, by the dying, by those seeking salvation or political protection. By the 13th century, the church owned a disproportionate share of the colony's best land, and the bishop at Gardar was arguably the most powerful individual in Greenland, more powerful than any secular chieftain, more powerful than any descendant of Erik. This would have appalled Erik, or perhaps not. Perhaps he would have recognized the strategy. The church was doing what Erik had done, claiming the best land, establishing centralized authority, building an institution that derived its legitimacy from being first and from controlling the resources that everyone else needed. The church's power in Greenland was structurally identical to Erik's power in the colony's founding years, differing only in the source of its authority, divine mandate rather than personal precedent, and in its durability. Erik's personal authority died with him. The church's institutional authority persisted for centuries. The churches themselves, 16 in the eastern settlement, perhaps 4 or 5 in the western, were the colony's most enduring buildings. Some were tiny, like Theodildur's original chapel at Bratalid. Others were larger, serving communities of several farms, functioning as parish churches where baptisms, marriages, and burials were recorded and the sacraments administered. The Valsey Church, whose ruins still stand in the eastern settlement, is the best preserved Norse building in Greenland, a rectangular stone structure roughly 16 meters long, with walls over a meter thick and gable ends still rising several meters above the ground. It was at Valsey that the last documented event in Norse Greenland took place, the wedding of 1408, recorded in the Icelandic annals. the final trace of a living community before the silence. The churches were built of stone because stone was what the land offered. The Greenlanders had no timber for permanent construction. Their turf longhouses were framed with driftwood and whalebone, materials that decayed and required constant replacement, so that a longhouse was never truly finished, but was instead a continuous project of maintenance and renewal. Stone endured. The churches endured. When the last Norse Greenlanders died or departed, when the turf farmsteads collapsed and the fields returned to scrub, the stone churches remained standing. The last vertical structures in a landscape reverting to emptiness. The Inuit who moved through the abandoned settlements in later centuries would have encountered them. Roofless, doorless, but upright, the walls still bearing the weight they had been built to bear, standing like tombstones for a civilization that had not known it was dying. Infant, the colony's relationship with Norway, its mother country, its trade partner, its sovereign, its lifeline, evolved across the centuries from dependence to neglect to abandonment, and the arc of that evolution is in many ways the arc of the colony's life. In the early period, from the founding through the 12th century, the relationship was one of mutual benefit, if not mutual equality. Greenland produced walrus ivory, sealskin rope, furs, and live animals, the white gerfalcons and polar bears that commanded extraordinary prices in European courts. Norway provided the manufactured goods and raw materials that Greenland could not produce. The trade was profitable for both parties. The ships came regularly. The connection held. In 1261, the Greenland colony formally submitted to the Norwegian crown, accepting royal sovereignty in exchange for the king's guarantee that a minimum number of trade ships would be sent to the colony each year. The agreement, part of a broader consolidation in which Iceland also submitted to Norwegian authority, was a recognition of reality. The colony was too small and too remote to sustain political independence, and formal submission to the crown offered, at least in theory, the security of a guaranteed trade connection. The guarantee was not honored, or rather, it was honored intermittently, imperfectly, and with declining enthusiasm as the 14th century progressed. The Norwegian crown was increasingly distracted by domestic politics, by the personal union with Sweden, by the catastrophic population loss of the Black Death, which reached Norway in 1349 and killed perhaps half the population. A kingdom reeling from plague, struggling to maintain its own institutional structures, had limited bandwidth for the needs of a colony 3,000 miles away whose primary export was an ivory that European markets were already beginning to replace with cheaper alternatives. The ships came less often. The gaps between visits lengthened. In the early colony, a ship might arrive every year or every other year. By the mid-14th century, the intervals had stretched to 5 years, 10 years, longer. Each gap was a period of increasing isolation, of dwindling supplies of iron and timber and grain, of children growing up who had never seen a ship from Norway, and for whom Europe was becoming as theoretical as Greenland had once been to Europeans. The Western settlement died first. Ivar Barderson's report of finding it empty, the farms abandoned, the livestock feral, dates to approximately 1350, though the exact year of his visit and the reliability of his account are both debated. What is not debated is the outcome. By the mid-14th century, the smaller and more northern of the two settlements was gone. Its roughly 90 farms, its churches, its community of perhaps 1,000 people, all of it ended, absorbed back into the landscape within a single generation. How it ended is unclear. The climate was deteriorating, the little ice age was tightening its grip, and the western settlement, farther north and more exposed than the eastern, would have felt the effects first and worst. Shorter growing seasons, more sea ice, less pasture. The margin that had always been thin now became non-existent. The Thule Inuit were present in the region and expanding. There may have been conflict. There may have been absorption. Some Western settlement Norse may have joined Inuit communities, abandoning the pastoral identity that could no longer sustain them. There may have been migration south to the eastern settlement, a contraction of the colony's footprint in response to conditions that no longer permitted its northernmost extension. The archaeological evidence does not resolve the question. The western settlement farms show signs of orderly abandonment in some cases, valuables removed, doors closed, the departure of people who expected to go somewhere else rather than the sudden evacuation of people fleeing violence. In other cases, the evidence is more ambiguous. Animals left in their stalls, objects left behind that would not have been abandoned willingly. The picture is messy, contradictory, resistant to the clean narrative that either catastrophe or orderly retreat would provide. The eastern settlement held longer. Through the second half of the 14th century and into the 15th, the remaining Norse community, now reduced, isolated, increasingly cut off from the trade networks and institutional connections that had sustained it, continued to farm, to hunt, to pray, to bury its dead in churchyards that were filling with the accumulated bones of 4 centuries. The Valsey wedding of 1408 is the last event we can date. After that, the record goes dark. What happened between 1408 and the final extinction of the colony is a void that scholarship has filled with hypotheses, but not with certainty. The most widely accepted reconstruction is gradual decline, a community shrinking through emigration, through falling birth rates, through mortality that exceeded replacement, through the slow attrition of a society that could no longer maintain itself. The last Norse Greenlanders may have numbered in the hundreds. They may have numbered in the dozens. They lived in a landscape that was getting colder, in buildings that were getting harder to maintain, eating a diet that was increasingly marine and decreasingly pastoral, praying in churches that no bishop had visited in decades, waiting for ships that no longer came. The image is haunting not because it is dramatic, but because it is not. There was no final battle. There was no last stand. There was no moment when someone said, "This is the end." There was only the slow subtraction, the gradual erasure, the quiet process by which a human community becomes first marginal, then vestigial, then archaeological. The question that this trajectory poses, and it is a question that returns us to Eric inevitably, because every question about Greenland returns to Eric, is whether the colony's fate was sealed from the beginning. There is a school of thought popular in environmental history and in the broader literature of civilizational collapse that treats the Norse Greenland colony as a cautionary tale, a society that failed to adapt, that clung to an imported identity and an imported economy when the environment demanded flexibility, that chose cultural continuity over biological survival and paid the ultimate price. Jared Diamond's Collapse, published in 2005, made this argument at length, presenting the Norse Greenlanders as a case study in maladaptation, a people who ate their cattle while their Inuit neighbors thrived on seal, who built churches while the Inuit built kayaks, who maintained a European identity to the point of extinction rather than adopt the Arctic technologies that might have saved them. The argument has force. The archaeological evidence supports certain elements of it. The Norse did not adopt the kayak, did not build snow houses, did not shift decisively to a marine economy. Their commitment to cattle farming visible in the maintenance of byres and hayfields even in the late settlement period, when the climate made cattle farming increasingly untenable, does suggest a population that valued cultural identity over adaptive efficiency. But the argument also simplifies. The choice between stay Norse and become Inuit was not a binary available to the people living it. Cultural identity is not a costume to be changed when the weather turns. The Norse Greenlanders were embedded in a web of relationships with the Norwegian crown, with the Catholic Church, with Icelandic trading partners, with their own ancestors and descendants that made their Norseness not merely a preference, but a structural condition of their existence. To abandon cattle farming was to abandon the economic basis of the social hierarchy. To abandon the church was to abandon the institutional framework that connected them to Europe. To adopt Inuit technologies required a relationship with the Inuit that the available evidence suggests was limited, often hostile, and constrained by mutual incomprehension. Moreover, the Inuit did not simply thrive while the Norse declined. The Thule expansion into Greenland was itself a response to changing conditions, and the Thule communities that ultimately replaced the Norse presence were themselves subject to fluctuations in population, resource availability, and climate stress. The contrast between Norse failure and Inuit success is real at the macro level. The Inuit survived in Greenland and the Norse did not, but at the micro level, the story is more complicated, more contingent, less amenable to the clean moral that Diamond and others have drawn from it. The most honest assessment is probably this. The Norse Greenland colony was viable under a specific set of conditions. The medieval warm period's temperatures, the walrus ivory trade's profitability, the Norwegian crown's willingness to maintain trade links, the absence of competing populations with superior Arctic technology. And when those conditions changed, the colony's capacity to adapt was limited by its own cultural commitments, by the slowness of information in a pre-modern world, and by the sheer geographical isolation that made every problem harder to solve and every solution harder to implement. Eric founded the colony under the right conditions. His descendants inherited it under worsening ones. The decline was not inevitable. Nothing in history is inevitable until after it has happened. But the margin was always thin, and thin margins do not forgive mistakes or bad luck, or the slow grind of climatic deterioration that no individual decision could have reversed. There's a particular archaeological finding from the later settlement period that distills the colony's predicament into a single object, and it is worth describing because it says something that pages of analysis cannot. Excavations at several late-period Norse farms in the eastern settlement have uncovered the remains of cattle that starved to death in their stalls. The bones are found in the byres, in the positions where the animals stood or lay when they died, and the osteological analysis shows the characteristic markers of severe malnutrition, bone resorption, arrested growth, the porosity that develops when a body begins consuming its own skeleton for calcium. The cattle starved because there was not enough hay. There was not enough hay because the growing season had shortened. The growing season had shortened because the climate had cooled. The climate had cooled because of large-scale atmospheric and oceanic patterns. Volcanic activity, changes in solar output, shifts in the North Atlantic Oscillation that operated on time scales and at distances entirely beyond the comprehension of a Norse farmer standing in a byre watching his cows die. The farmer did not know why the hay was insufficient. He knew only that it was. He knew that the winter was longer than his father remembered, that the ice in the fjord came earlier and stayed later, that the grass grew slower and the cows ate faster. He knew that the system his grandfather had built, the careful balance of hayfield and byre, of summer cutting and winter feeding, was no longer working, and he did not know how to fix it, because the system had been designed for a climate that no longer existed. He would have tried. The evidence suggests they tried. Farms in the late period show signs of intensified effort, expanded hayfields, modified irrigation, attempts to squeeze more productivity from land that was yielding less. They did not sit passively and wait for death. They worked harder. They adapted within the framework available to them. The framework was insufficient. The cows died in their stalls. The farmer buried them or left them where they lay and faced the spring without milk, without butter, without cheese, without the calves that would have replaced the dead animals, without the foundation of the pastoral economy that had defined his people since before they left Norway. This is not a story about stupidity. It is not a story about cultural rigidity, though rigidity played its part. It is a story about the collision between human will and material constraint, about the moment when determination, ingenuity, hard work, and inherited knowledge are not enough, because the problem is not one that determination, ingenuity, hard work, or inherited knowledge can solve. Eric would have understood the determination. He would have understood the work. He would not have understood the climate science. No one in his century could have. The medieval warm period that made his colony possible was not a gift anyone knew they were receiving, and the little ice age that ended it was not a punishment anyone knew was coming. The Greenlanders lived inside a climatic envelope that was opening when they arrived and closing when they died, and neither the opening nor the closing was visible to anyone standing inside it. This is the deepest cruelty of the colony's fate. Not that they failed to adapt, but that the thing they needed to adapt to was invisible. You cannot fight a glacier. You cannot negotiate with a sea current. You cannot petition the sun to shine longer on your hayfield. The material forces that determined the colony's survival operated beneath the threshold of human perception and beyond the reach of human agency. And the colony's decline was, in the most literal sense, a matter of physics rather than character. The character was sufficient. Eric's character was sufficient for the founding. His descendants' character was sufficient for the maintenance. The physics changed. The character could not change the physics. And yet the colony endured for 5 centuries before the physics won. 5 centuries of people being born, growing up, working, marrying, having children, growing old, and dying in the fjords of southwestern Greenland. 5 centuries of liturgical calendar observed, of saints' days marked, of Christmas celebrated in turf-roof churches while the wind screamed off the ice cap, and the aurora pulsed green above the frozen fjords. 5 centuries of hay cut and stacked and rationed through winters that were dark and long and cold in ways that people who have not experienced high-latitude darkness cannot fully imagine. The people who lived those 5 centuries are mostly anonymous to us. The saga tradition preserved the founding generation, Erik, Theodhildur, Leif, Freydis, the first settlers, and then largely fell silent about Greenland's internal history. The Icelandic annals record occasional events, the appointment of a new bishop, the wreck of a ship, the Valsey wedding. Norwegian administrative records mention the colony in the context of tithes, trade privileges, and the appointment of officials. But the vast majority of the people who lived in Norse Greenland, the farmers, the hunters, the priests, the women who wove the homespun cloth and milked the diminishing cattle and bore the children who would inherit the diminishing farms, left no individual record. They are known only in aggregate through the archaeology of their middens and their bones, through the chemical signatures in their teeth that tell us what they ate, through the wear patterns on their skeletons that tell us how they worked. They worked hard. The osteological evidence is unambiguous on this point. Skeletal remains from Greenlandic Norse cemeteries show high rates of degenerative joint disease, healed fractures, dental wear from a coarse diet, and the general markers of bodies used intensively throughout a lifespan. The women's skeletons show the particular patterns associated with textile production: repetitive stress in the shoulders and hands from carding, spinning, and weaving, and with dairy processing, the endless churning and pressing that converted milk into the butter and cheese that constituted a significant portion of the colony's caloric intake. The men's skeletons show the patterns of heavy manual labor, farming, construction, boat handling, the Nordorsetta hunt. These were not comfortable lives. They were not lives of leisure or abundance or ease. They were lives shaped by the requirements of survival in a place that demanded constant, unrelenting effort and punished any lapse with consequences that could be fatal. A broken leg during haying season could mean a winter without sufficient fodder. A failed hunt could mean a household without seal oil. A difficult birth without physician or midwife beyond the community's own limited expertise could mean the death of mother and child both. And they chose this. Or their ancestors chose it for them, which amounts to the same thing after a generation. The first settlers followed Erik across the Atlantic in search of land and independence. Their children and grandchildren were born into the choice already made, inheriting a home that was not optional, a landscape that was not negotiable, a set of challenges that had to be met because there was no alternative and no elsewhere. They were Greenlanders by birth, by circumstance, by the accumulated weight of generations, and the question of whether Greenland was a good place to live was academic. It was where they lived, and they lived there as well as the conditions permitted. Erik gave them that. The conditions, the challenges, the landscape, the identity, all of it flowed from his decision to sail west in 982 and his decision to bring others in 985. Every birth in the colony was downstream of his choice. Every death was downstream of his choice. Every church built, every cow milked, every walrus killed, every child who grew up speaking Norse in a fjord named after a man who had been too violent for Iceland, all of it was Eric's legacy. Though Eric could not have conceived of it in those terms and would probably not have cared if he could. He was a practical man. Practical men do not think in terms of legacy. They think in terms of the next season, the next ship, the next wall that needs repair. The legacy accrues behind them like a wake behind a boat, visible to everyone except the person at the helm. Eric was at the helm. He looked forward. The wake spread behind him for 500 years, and now the wake has stilled. The boat is gone. The water has closed over the place where it passed, and what remains is the question that every vanished civilization leaves behind. Not how it ended, but what it was while it lasted, and what its existence means to those of us who stand on the shore afterward looking at the water, trying to read the surface for traces of what moved beneath it. We have followed Eric from Rogaland to Hornstrandir, from Hornstrandir to the Dales, from the Dales to Breidafjordur, from Breidafjordur to the Atlantic, from the Atlantic to the fjords of southwestern Greenland. We have watched him kill, be judged, be expelled, and sail. We have watched him prospect a frozen coastline with the eye of a man who understood land as currency and naming as leverage. We have watched him return to Iceland and sell a place he called green to people desperate enough to believe him, or desperate enough not to care whether the name was honest, as long as the land was real. We have watched him found a colony, lose 11 ships in the founding, build a farm, refuse a god, watch his children surpass him, and die in a turf house while an epidemic moved through the settlement he had made. We have, in other words, followed the silhouette. The man behind it remains where the sources left him, in shadow, visible only by the shape of the light he blocked. But there is something we have not yet done, and it is the thing that the story at this late stage requires. We have not placed Eric within the larger pattern of Norse expansion and asked what his particular contribution and his specific variant of the westward impulse tells us about the phenomenon as a whole. We have treated him as an individual. He was also a symptom. And the disease, if that is the right word, was one of the most consequential demographic movements in the history of the North Atlantic world. The Norse expansion across the North Atlantic followed a logic that was geographical before it was cultural, economic before it was personal. The stepping stone pattern, Norway to Shetland, Shetland to Faroe, Faroe to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to Vinland, was not planned by any central authority or driven by any coordinated vision. It was emergent. It arose from the interaction of three forces: population pressure in Scandinavia, the development of ships capable of open ocean sailing, and the existence of a chain of islands and land masses spaced at intervals that Norse vessels could cross in a few days to a few weeks. Each step followed the previous one with a logic that was, in retrospect, almost mechanical. When the Shetlands filled, people moved to the Faroes. When the Faroes filled, people moved to Iceland. When Iceland filled Ifurs, or rather when the best land in Iceland was claimed and the remaining options were marginal enough to make the next crossing look attractive, people were ready to move again. The question was always the same: is there land out there? And the answer, delivered by storm-blown sailors and returning traders, was always maybe, possibly. Someone saw something. Eric's Greenland venture fits this pattern precisely. He was not an innovator. He was the next iteration of a process that had been running for 2 centuries. The difference, the thing that makes Eric's story distinct from the stories of the men who settled the Shetlands or the Faroes or Iceland, is that Greenland was the step too far. Or rather, it was the step that worked under one set of conditions and failed under another, the step that extended the chain past the point where the links could hold under stress. The Shetlands and Faroes were close to Norway and climatically similar. Iceland was farther and harder, but its combination of geothermal heat, extensive coastline, and relatively moderate maritime climate, even at 65 degrees north, the Gulf Stream's dying influence kept Iceland warmer than its latitude would suggest, made it viably habitable on a large scale. Iceland could sustain a population of tens of thousands. It could grow barley, it could export dried fish and homespun cloth, it could maintain regular trade with Norway and the British Isles. It was marginal, but its margin was wide enough to absorb bad years, bad decades, even the occasional volcanic eruption. Greenland's margin was not. Greenland was the place where the stepping stone logic of Norse expansion encountered a coastline that could be settled but not sustained. Not indefinitely, not without external support, not once the conditions that had made it barely possible shifted even slightly toward the impossible. Every element of the Greenlandic economy was more precarious than its Icelandic equivalent. The growing season was shorter. The trade route was longer. The population base was smaller. The fallback options when a harvest failed or a ship didn't come were fewer and grimmer. Eric could not have known this. He operated with the information available to him. 3 years of exploration during the warmest centuries the North Atlantic had seen in millennia. And the information told him the fjords were viable. The information was not wrong. It was incomplete. The information described a moment. The colony needed a millennium. This is the tragedy of Greenland, if tragedy is the right word for a process that unfolded across centuries and involved no single moment of catastrophic failure. The founding was rational. The settlement was competent. The society that developed was functional, literate, Christian, connected to the broader European world, and in many respects indistinguishable from the other Norse communities of the medieval North Atlantic. It did everything right. Or at least everything that the Norse cultural toolkit contained, and it still ended because the things it needed to do differently were not within its repertoire, and the things it needed to survive were not within its control. Eric gave them the beginning. The climate gave them the middle. The climate took the end. There is a way of thinking about Eric that places him not in the company of explorers and founders, but in the company of a different kind of historical figure entirely. The exile who remakes himself through geography. The pattern is ancient and widespread. Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Aeneas fleeing Troy to found Rome. The Puritan separatists crossing the Atlantic to Massachusetts. The convicts shipped to Botany Bay who became the founders of Australia. In each case, a person or group expelled from one society becomes the nucleus of another, and the expulsion, the violence, the disgrace, the rupture, becomes retroactively the origin story of something larger than the individual who suffered it. The comparison is imperfect in every case, because comparisons across millennia and cultures are always imperfect. But the structural similarity is worth noting. Eric did not choose to leave Iceland. He was forced out. His departure was a punishment, not a quest. And yet the punishment produced the founding, and the founding produced the colony, and the colony produced the platform from which his son reached North America. The most consequential thing Eric ever did, the thing for which history remembers him, was a byproduct of the worst thing that happened to him. Exile was not the obstacle to his achievement. It was the mechanism. This pattern, exile as engine, punishment as catalyst, recurs often enough in human history to suggest something structural rather than coincidental. Societies expel their most disruptive members. The most disruptive members, by definition, are the ones least willing to accept the constraints of existing social arrangements. When those members reach empty land, land without prior social arrangements, the same quality that made them intolerable becomes the quality that makes them effective. The inability to submit becomes the capacity to lead. The refusal to compromise becomes the willingness to endure. The violence that was pathological in a settled society becomes functional on a frontier where the primary adversary is not another person, but the land itself. This does not redeem the violence. Eric killed people. The people he killed were not abstractions. They were men with families, with farms, with lives that ended because Eric could not resolve a property dispute without a weapon. No amount of colonial achievement retroactively justifies those deaths. The colony and the killings exist in the same biography without one canceling the other. But the pattern suggests that the relationship between social dysfunction and historical consequence is more complicated than our moral categories easily accommodate. We want founders to be admirable. We want the people who build civilizations to be the people we would have wanted as neighbors. Eric was not that person. He was the person his neighbors wanted gone, and the wanting gone was precisely what produced the going, and the going was precisely what produced the finding, and the finding was precisely what produced the civilization. The categories collapse. The moral ledger refuses to balance. This is not a failure of analysis. It is a feature of the material. Let us descend one more time into the physical world that Eric knew. Not the world of politics and saga and legacy, but the world of stone and water and ice and grass, the world that existed before he arrived and exists still, indifferent to everything he did in it. The fjords of southwestern Greenland are, in geological terms, young. They were carved by glaciers during the Pleistocene, gouged into the gneiss and granite of the Greenlandic bedrock by rivers of ice that advanced and retreated over cycles of 100,000 years. The U-shaped valleys, the sheer walls dropping to the water, the hanging valleys where tributary glaciers once joined the main flow. All of this is glacial architecture, sculpted on a timescale that makes human habitation, even 5 centuries of it, a brief interruption in a geological conversation that has been going on for millions of years. The bedrock itself is among the oldest on Earth. The Greenlandic craton, the stable core of the island's geology, is Archean, dating to roughly 3 billion years ago. The gneiss that Eric's thralls stacked into the walls of Bratalid's longhouse was formed when the Earth was young enough that the atmosphere contained no oxygen, when the only life was microbial, when the continents had not yet assembled into their current configuration. Eric built his house from stones that were older than complex life. He did not know this, and it would not have mattered to him if he had. The stones were useful. He used them. The ice cap that dominates the island's interiors. The Greenland ice sheet, covering 1.71 million square kilometers, containing roughly 10% of all the fresh water on Earth, is younger than the bedrock but older than any human civilization. Ice cores drilled from its deepest layers reach back over 100,000 years, recording in the chemistry of their annual layers the temperature, atmospheric composition, and volcanic activity of every year since before the last ice age. The ice remembers what no human memory could. It remembers centuries when Greenland was warmer than it is now, and centuries when it was colder, and the long oscillation between the two that determines, with absolute indifference to human preference, what the margin of habitability will be in any given decade. Eric lived on the narrow shelf between the ice and the sea. That shelf, the habitable fringe of southwestern Greenland, is measured in tens of kilometers at its widest. Behind it, the ice cap rises to an altitude of over 3,000 meters, a dome of compressed snow that generates its own weather and radiates cold into the surrounding fjords with the steady, implacable patience of a geological process that does not distinguish between centuries and seconds. Before it, the sea, the Labrador Sea, the Davis Strait, carries currents that mix Arctic and Atlantic water in patterns that influence the climate of the entire northern hemisphere. Eric's colony existed in the margin between these two immensities. The ice pushed from one direction, the sea pushed from the other. The habitable strip between them was a gift of temporary conditions. The medieval warm periods, slightly elevated temperatures, the retreat of the ice cap's margin by a few critical kilometers, the extension of the growing season by a few critical weeks. When those conditions reversed, the strip narrowed, and the people on it had nowhere to go. This is the physical truth beneath the human story, and it is the truth that the saga writers could not have known, and that Eric himself experienced only as weather, as a good summer or a bad one, as ice in the fjord earlier or later than expected, as grass growing high enough to cut or not high enough, as the perpetual, daily, seasonal negotiation with a landscape that held his survival in its hands and could close those hands at any time. The landscape did not care about Eric. It did not care about his colony. It did not care about his son's discovery of North America or his daughter's massacre in Vinland or the churches built in his fjords or the bishops appointed to his shores. The gneiss is 3 billion years old. The ice is 100,000 years old. The Norse were there for 500 years. The land has already forgotten them. Or not forgotten. The land does not forget because the land does not remember. It simply continues. The fjords fill and empty with the tides. The ice cap grows and retreats with the temperature. The grass grows in the fjord bottoms when the summers are warm enough and dies back when they are not. The cycles proceed without reference to the human events that occurred within them, without acknowledgement of the turf walls that rose and fell, the cattle that grazed and starved, the people who lived and died and left their bones in churchyards that are now overgrown with the same grass their ancestors cut for hay. This is the context in which Eric's achievement must ultimately be understood, not against the backdrop of human history alone, but against the backdrop of the physical world that made human history possible, and that will continue long after the last human history has been written. Eric founded a colony on a geological margin. The margin shifted. The colony ended. The margin is still there, still shifting, still indifferent. The ice does not know Eric's name. But we know it. And the knowing is itself a phenomenon worth examining because the fact that we remember Eric the Red, that his name persists, that his story is told, that you are listening to it now, is neither inevitable nor accidental. It is the product of a specific chain of transmission, a series of decisions made by specific people over 1,000 years, each of whom chose to carry his story forward rather than let it drop. The chain begins with the people who knew him, his family, his settlers, the community at Bratalid that gathered in the longhouse during the long dark and told stories. They told Eric's story because it was their story and the story of how they came to be where they were, of why they lived in these fjords instead of the ones their grandparents had left behind. Eric's story was the colony's origin myth, the narrative that explained and justified the community's existence, that answered the question every child eventually asks, why do we live here? The answer was because a man was thrown out of Iceland and he sailed west and he found this place and he brought us here. The answer was Eric. And so Eric's story was told and retold and shaped in the telling, and carried from Greenland to Iceland on the lips of traders and travelers, and told again in Icelandic farmsteads to Icelandic audiences who had their own reasons for preserving it. Because many of them were kin to the settlers, because the Greenland colony was a living part of the Icelandic world, because stories of exploration and founding were the literature of a culture that had been founded by exploration. The oral tradition persisted for 200 years. 200 years of retelling, of embellishment, of the gradual accretion of narrative structure and literary convention. The person who first told the story of Eric's horse stumbling on the way to Leif's ship may have been someone who was there, or may have been someone who heard it from someone who was there, or may have been someone who invented the detail because it made the story work, because the Norse narrative tradition required omens at pivotal moments, and a stumbling horse was a recognized omen form. We cannot separate the historical Eric from the literary Eric because the literary Eric is the only one we have access to, and the literary Eric was built layer by layer over 2 centuries of oral performance before anyone set pen to parchment. The parchment came in the 13th century. The saga writers, anonymous for the most part, though some candidates have been proposed for specific texts, committed the oral traditions to writing in a culture that was itself undergoing a transformation from oral to literate, from pagan to fully Christian, from independent commonwealth to subject of the Norwegian crown. The saga writers were not neutral transcribers. They were authors working within literary conventions, serving audiences with specific expectations, operating under the ideological pressures of a Christian intellectual culture that viewed the pagan past with a complicated mixture of pride, nostalgia, and theological discomfort. The sagas they produced are, as we discussed at the beginning of this script, literary works of extraordinary quality, spare, direct, psychologically acute, structurally sophisticated. They are also partial, biased, and shaped by the concerns of their own time rather than the time they describe. The Erik, who appears in Erik's Saga Rauda and Grenlandinga Saga, is a 13th century construction. Not a fabrication, not a fantasy, but a construction built from oral materials by hands that had their own purposes. Those purposes included the glorification of the Icelandic past, the demonstration that Icelanders had reached the New World before anyone else in Europe, and the integration of the pagan founding generation into a Christian historical narrative that could accommodate their achievements without endorsing their beliefs. Erik's paganism is noted, but not condemned. His violence is recorded, but not moralized. His founding of Greenland is celebrated, but not quite sanctified. The saga writers give him room to be what he was, complicated, capable, dangerous, consequential, without forcing him into a moral category that their Christian framework would have required and that their narrative instinct told them would diminish the story. This is the saga's great gift to posterity. They preserved Erik as a person rather than a symbol. They did not make him a hero. They did not make him a villain. They made him a man who did things, and they recorded the things he did, and they trusted their audience to make of him what they would. We are still making of him what we will. Every generation since the 13th century has found in Erik's story the elements most relevant to its own concerns. The Romantic nationalists of the 19th century found a Viking adventurer, a symbol of Nordic daring and enterprise. The early 20th century found a proto-colonist, a figure who validated European expansion into new territories. The environmental historians of the late 20th century found a cautionary tale about ecological hubris. The popular culture of the 21st century finds a brand, Erik the Red, as shorthand for Vikings, for exploration, for the Norse world that has become, through television and tourism, and a vague cultural nostalgia for the pre-modern, one of the most marketable historical periods in the contemporary imagination. None of these Eriks is the real Erik. All of them contain fragments of him. The real Erik, the man who stood on the shore in 982, thick-bodied and red-haired and carrying the stain of his killings, is beyond recovery. He exists now only in the composite of all the Eriks that have been constructed from his story, layered one atop another like the turf blocks of his longhouse, each layer compressing the one beneath it, the whole structure leaning slightly, settling under its own weight but holding. The ruins at Bratalid are open to the sky now. The turf walls that Erik raised, or more precisely, the turf walls that were raised on the site Erik chose, rebuilt and modified over the centuries as each generation maintained and expanded the farm, have collapsed into low mounds of earth barely distinguishable from the natural contours of the landscape. The outlines of buildings are visible to the trained eye. A rectangular depression here marks a longhouse, a circular mound there marks a pen, a scatter of stones marks the foundation of a structure whose purpose can only be guessed from its dimensions and its position relative to the other ruins. Theodhildur's church has been reconstructed, a small turf replica built near the site of the original, based on the archaeological evidence from Krog's excavation. It is tiny. You could cross it in 4 strides. The walls are thick and the interior is dim, and when the door is closed, the only light comes from what seeps through the turf at the edges and from whatever lamp or candle the visitor has brought. It is the kind of space that requires you to be still, that compresses your attention into the small volume of enclosed air and makes you conscious of your own breathing. It is the kind of space that could hold a prayer. Whether Theodhildur prayed in exactly this configuration of turf and stone, we cannot verify. The reconstruction is an approximation, an honest approximation, based on good archaeology, but an approximation nonetheless. The original church is gone. The original Bratalid is gone. The original Erik is gone. What remains is inference, reconstruction, the careful, disciplined guessing that constitutes the best we can do with a past that left material traces, but no voice recordings, no photographs, no diaries, no tweets. The fjord is there. The fjord has not changed in any way that a human observer standing on the shore would notice, though a geologist would note that the ice margin has shifted, that the water temperature has fluctuated, that the sediment at the fjord bottom records 1,000 years of deposition since the Norse. The water is still black. The mountains on either side still drop steeply to the waterline. The wind still comes down from the ice cap, cold and persistent, pressing against whatever stands in its path. In the summer, the grass still grows in the fjord bottom. It is not tall grass. It is not lush grass. But it is green. Genuinely, honestly green. The color Eric promised. The color that was not entirely a lie. The color that the land delivers in its brief annual concession to the sun before the dark returns. Sheep graze there now. Not Norse sheep. Modern sheep, kept by the Inuit and Danish residents of the modern settlement near the old Norse site. The sheep eat the grass that grows where Eric's cattle grazed. The grass grows from soil that contains, in its deepest layers, the organic residue of 1,000 years of human habitation, the decomposed manure of Norse livestock, the charcoal of Norse hearth fires, the molecular traces of a community that lived and died and returned to the earth it had tried to cultivate. The soil does not distinguish between the Norse and the modern. It accepts what falls on it, incorporates what decomposes, and grows what the climate permits. The grass that feeds the modern sheep is, in a sense, feeding on the Norse, on the accumulated organic legacy of 5 centuries of settlement, broken down into the elemental chemistry of nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon, recycled through the slow alchemy of decomposition into a form that roots can absorb and chlorophyll can use. This is not metaphor. This is biochemistry. The Norse are in the soil. Their cattle are in the soil. Their hay is in the soil. Their bodies, buried in churchyards whose crosses have fallen and whose stones have sunk into the earth, are in the soil. The physical substance of the colony has been reabsorbed into the landscape, and the landscape has done with it what the landscape always does, converted it into the material from which new life grows without memory, without sentiment, without regard for the human significance of the material being processed. Eric is in that soil, or rather, the molecules that were once organized into the pattern called Eric, the calcium of his bones, the iron of his blood, the carbon of his muscle and fat, and the copper-red keratin of his hair, have long since dispersed into the broader chemistry of the Greenlandic earth, indistinguishable from the molecules of every other organism that has lived and died in those fjords across the millennia. He is there in the most literal sense, and he is not there in the only sense that matters to the living. Idde? The question returns. The question that has been circling this narrative since its opening. The question the saga writers did not ask because they did not think in these terms. The question that we, from our distance, cannot avoid. What was it for? 5 centuries of human effort at the edge of the habitable world. Thousands of lives lived in conditions that demanded everything and guaranteed nothing. Children born into darkness and cold, who grew up cutting hay and hunting seal and praying in turf churches, who raised their own children to do the same, who died and were buried in ground that froze solid for 7 months of the year. Walrus hunters who paddled into Arctic waters and did not come back. Farmers who watched their cattle starve in February and started again in May. Women who wove cloth and churned butter and bore children and buried children and endured the long dark with a fortitude that the sources do not record because the sources did not consider it remarkable. Because in the world the sources described, the endurance of women was not a story but a precondition for all the other stories. What was it for? The colony produced no lasting state. It left no continuous cultural tradition. Its contribution to the broader arc of European history was, in material terms, minimal. Some ivory, some furs, a few diplomatic curiosities, and the Vinland voyages, which led nowhere for 5 centuries until Columbus arrived at the same continent from a different direction, and this time the connection held. The Norse Greenlanders were a dead end. Magnificent dead end, a 5-century dead end, but a dead end nonetheless, a branch of the human story that grew outward and upward and then stopped, and the tree continued without it. This is the answer that the logic of historical consequence provides, and it is not wrong, but it is not sufficient, because the logic of historical consequence evaluates human communities by their outputs, by what they produced, what they influenced, what they left behind for the next generation to build on, And by that standard, every community that fails to persist is a failure, and every life lived within it is wasted, and every effort spent sustaining it is effort that might as well not have been made. This standard is obscene, not wrong exactly, but obscene, in the sense that it measures human experience against a scale that human experience cannot satisfy. No life is lived for the sake of its historical consequences. No farmer cuts hay because his great-great-grandchildren will benefit. No mother nurses a child because the demographic curve requires it. No one endures a Greenlandic winter because the colony must persist. They endure it because the alternative is not enduring it, and the alternative to not enduring it is death, and they are not ready to die, and so they build the fire higher and wait for the light to return. The colony was not for anything. It was a life. It was 5 centuries of lives. It was the accumulation of daily acts of feeding, building, repairing, warming, burying, beginning again, performed by people who did not experience themselves as historical figures in a narrative of civilizational rise and decline, but as individuals trying to get through the week. The question, what was it for, is a question asked from outside, from above, from the God's eye view that sees the whole arc and judges it by its end point. The people inside the ark did not have that view. They had the view from the byre door on a March morning, watching for the first sign that the ice in the fjord was beginning to break. Eric had that view. Standing at the door of the longhouse at Bratalid, looking down the fjord toward the open water, he did not see 5 centuries of consequence stretching out before him. He saw the fjord. He saw the ice. He saw the grass beginning to emerge from the snow. He saw his cattle, thin after the winter, nosing at the bare ground. He saw the work that needed doing, the walls to repair, the hay to plan for, the ships to ready for the Nordorsetta, the disputes to settle, the colony to hold together for another season. He did the work. That was his answer to the question that he did not know was being asked. The work was never glamorous. This is something the saga tradition, for all its honesty, cannot fully convey, because the saga tradition is a narrative form, and narrative requires events, killings, voyages, conversions, discoveries, and the substance of Eric's life, like the substance of every life, was mostly not events. It was mostly repetition. The same walls repaired every autumn, the same hay cut every August, the same cattle fed every morning from October to May, the same wind resisted, the same cold endured, the same darkness waited out, the same calculation performed at the beginning of every winter. How much fodder, how many animals, how many mouths, how many weeks until the light returns? The same answer, probably enough. Possibly not. We will see. This is the texture that no saga preserves and no monument commemorates. The sheer repetitive dailiness of sustaining human life in a place that does not want you there. Eric's founding of Greenland was a single act, dramatic and consequential. The maintenance of Greenland was 10,000 acts, each one unremarkable, each one necessary, each one performed by someone whose name we will never know, in a byre or a hay field or a kitchen that has since returned to earth. The unnamed are the colony's true population. Eric is the name we know because the sagas needed a protagonist, because the oral tradition needed an origin, because every story requires a beginning, and Eric was the beginning. But the colony was not Eric. The colony was the woman who woke before dawn to milk the last surviving cow in a byre that smelled of damp straw and animal heat and the particular sourness of a beast that has not eaten enough. The colony was the boy sent to the beach to gather driftwood, scanning the waterline for the gray bleached logs that the Siberian rivers had surrendered to the Arctic Ocean years or decades before. The colony was the hunter in the Nordorsetta, knee-deep in frigid water on a gravel beach, driving a lance into the neck of a walrus that bellowed and thrashed and bled into the surf. The colony was the priest at Gardar saying Mass in a stone cathedral at the edge of the known world, lifting the communion wafer in hands that were cracked and red with cold, speaking Latin to a congregation that understood the ritual, if not the language, performing the rites that connected this tiny community to the vast body of Christendom, and through Christendom to Rome to Jerusalem to the entire architecture of medieval European civilization. These people are not in the sagas. They are in the ground. Their bones lie in the churchyards of the Eastern settlement, arranged in the east-west orientation that medieval Christian burial required, their arms crossed over chests that once drew breath in the thin, cold air of the fjords. Their teeth are worn from a diet of dried fish and coarse ground grain. Their joints are calcified from decades of labor. Their skulls tell us nothing about what they thought, what they hoped, what they feared in the long dark. Their bones tell us only what they did. They worked, they ate, they endured, and then they stopped. They deserve to be named, and they cannot be. This is one of the cruelties of the historical record, and not that it lies, but that it selects, and the selection criteria favor the dramatic over the ordinary, the founder over the farmer, the man who kills over the woman who feeds. Eric is remembered because he was violent enough to be exiled and shrewd enough to found a colony. The thousands who lived in that colony, who sustained it across half a millennium, who did the actual work of civilization, the growing and making and mending and bearing and burying, are remembered only in aggregate as a population statistic, as a footnote to the story of the man who brought them there. This is not Eric's fault. He did not choose to be the one the sagas remembered. The sagas chose him because he fit the form. The individual protagonist whose actions drive the narrative forward, the great man whose will shapes the world. The form is powerful. The form is seductive. The form is also a distortion because it places the weight of the story on the one and distributes the lives of the many into background, into context, into the scenery through which the protagonist moves. We have used that form throughout this script because it is the form available to us and because Eric's life does in fact constitute a remarkable story. But we should acknowledge, here at the end, that the form has cost us something. It has cost us the colony as it actually was. Not a man's achievement, but a community's labor, not a founder's vision, but a collective's endurance, not one life, but thousands of lives, lived simultaneously and in parallel. Each one is real and as complete and as significant as the one the sagas chose to preserve. The sagas chose Eric because we have followed their choice. But the colony was larger than any one man, and the lives within it were not subordinate to his. They were their own lives, lived for their own reasons, ended by their own causes, and they mattered. Not because they contributed to Eric's legacy, but because they were lived, because the living of them was the point, because no life requires justification by historical consequence to have been worth the breath it cost. The last residents of the Eastern settlement died without knowing they were the last. This is worth saying clearly because the modern narrative of the colony's end, the narrative of decline, of abandonment, of a civilization that failed, imposes a shape on the ending that the people living through it could not have perceived. They did not know they were declining. They knew the winters were harder. They knew the hay was thinner. They knew the ships came less often. They knew that the bishop's seat at Garter had been vacant for years, that no new bishop had been sent from Norway, that the institutional connections binding them to Europe were fraying strand by strand. They knew these things as conditions, not as a trajectory. They experienced them as weather, not as history. The distinction matters. To call the colony's end a failure is to see it from our vantage, from the outside, from the after, from the position of someone who knows the end of the story and reads it backward into every preceding chapter. The people living the end did not have our vantage. They had the fjord and the ice and the hay that was or was not sufficient, and the ship that was or was not coming, and the prayer that was or was not answered. They did not fail. They persisted until they could not persist any longer, and the difference between persistence and failure is not a matter of outcome, but of orientation, of whether you are looking at the people or at the result. Look at the people. A woman in the Eastern settlement sometime in the early 15th century standing in a doorway of a turf house that her great-grandmother's great-grandmother built. The doorway faces the fjord. The fjord is partially frozen, more frozen than it used to be in this month, though she has no quantitative record of this, only the memory of older relatives saying the ice used to break earlier. She has 3 children. 2 of them are healthy. One has been coughing since November. The cow died in January. There is seal meat stored in the cold room, enough for a few more weeks. After that she will need to hunt, or her husband will need to hunt, or the neighbors will share, or they will eat less, or the coughing child will not survive to see the grass come back. She is not thinking about Eric the Red. She is not thinking about the founding of the colony, or the Vinland voyages, or the 5 centuries of history that connect her doorway to a ship launched from Bratalid in 985. She is thinking about the coughing child, and the dead cow, and the ice in the fjord. She is thinking about next week. She is the colony. In that moment, in that doorway, she is everything the colony ever was. The full weight of 5 centuries of human habitation compressed into a single woman standing in a single doorway trying to figure out how to keep her children alive until spring. She does not know that she is among the last. She does not know that within a generation, maybe less, there will be no one standing in this doorway, no one tending this farm, no one speaking Norse in these fjords. She does not know that the turf walls behind her will collapse, that the church down the fjord will lose its roof, that the grass will grow over everything, and the only visitors for centuries will be Inuit hunters who will note the ruins with curiosity and move on. She knows only the ice, and the child, and the diminishing store of seal meat, and the sound of wind against turf, and the quality of light through the doorway. Gray, thin, the light of a latitude that rations its sun with the parsimony of a land that has never been generous with anything. We cannot name her. The sources do not permit it. She is inferred from bones and middens and the logic of demographic decline. She is constructed from absence, from the gap between the last documented event in 1408 and the silence that follows. She may not have stood in precisely this doorway at precisely this moment, but someone did. Someone was last. Someone stood in the last occupied farmstead in the eastern settlement on the last day it was occupied and then left, or stayed and died. And either way the occupation ended, and the 5 centuries were over. The ending was not an event. It was a subtraction. 1 fewer farm, 1 fewer family, 1 fewer fire in 1 fewer hearth, until the number of fires reached 0 and the darkness that had always been waiting at the edges of the settlement moved in to fill the space that the fires had held. Eric's name survived the colony he founded. It survived in the sagas, carried to Iceland by the last ships, preserved in manuscripts that were copied and recopied across the centuries by scribes who may not have known that the colony they were writing about had already ceased to exist. The sagas entered the European scholarly tradition in the 17th and 18th centuries, when Scandinavian antiquarians began systematically collecting, editing, and publishing the medieval Icelandic texts. Eric emerged from the manuscripts into the world of printed books, of academic footnotes, of the slowly assembling picture of the Norse world that modern scholarship has been constructing for 300 years. He became, in the process, a figure of some cultural utility. The Scandinavian national movements of the 19th century found in Eric and his kin a source of pride, proof that the Norse had reached the New World before Columbus, that Scandinavian civilization had a claim to priority in the European exploration of the Americas. This claim was not universally accepted. For decades, the Vinland sagas were dismissed by mainstream historians as legend, as literary invention, as the wishful thinking of a small nation eager to claim a continent. But it persisted in Scandinavian popular culture, and eventually, with the excavation of Lonso Meadows in the 1960s, received its definitive confirmation. The confirmation changed nothing about Eric himself, but it changed everything about his reception. The man who had been a footnote in Scandinavian literary history became a figure in world history. The patriarch of the family that reached North America, the founder of the colony that made the crossing possible. Leif Erikson received the greater fame, as explorers always do over the people who create the conditions for exploration, but Eric was there behind him, the necessary precondition, the exile whose exile produced the platform. Today, Eric the Red occupies a peculiar place in the popular imagination. He is famous enough to be recognized by name. Most educated people in the Western world have heard of him, but not famous enough to be understood. The popular version is a caricature. The red-bearded Viking who was kicked out of Iceland and discovered Greenland, who tricked people into settling there by calling it green. It is not exactly wrong. It is drastically insufficient. It omits the violence that drove him out. It omits the intelligence that brought him back. It omits the colony that endured for 5 centuries. It omits the unnamed thousands who lived and died in the fjords. It omits the structural forces, climate, geography, trade, disease that determine the colony's arc from founding to extinction. It omits everything that makes Eric's story worth telling at a length greater than a paragraph. The caricature persists because caricatures are efficient. They compress complexity into a recognizable shape. Eric the Red, the Viking who named ice Greenland. It fits on a postage stamp. It fills a trivia question. It provides a punchline for the observation that marketing has always existed. And it is true in the way that a silhouette is true. It captures the outline and loses everything inside it. We have spent the length of this script trying to fill in the interior of that silhouette. We have not succeeded entirely because the sources do not permit full success, because the man behind the outline is irretrievable, because 1,000 years of transmission have smoothed and shaped and selected until the Eric we can access is not the Eric who lived, but the Eric who survived the process of being remembered. This is the condition of all historical knowledge, not merely of Eric's. The past is not a place we can visit. It is a set of traces, material, textual, chemical, genetic, from which we construct interpretations that are always provisional, always incomplete, always shaped by the questions we bring and the methods we use, and the assumptions we cannot see because they are the medium in which we think. The Eric of this script is one construction among many possible Erics, built from the same limited materials. 2 sagas, a settlement register, a ruined church, the chemistry of ice cores, and Mai, assembled by a hand that has its own biases, its own narrative preferences, its own ideas about what matters and what can be set aside. We have tried to hold the complexity. We have tried to show the killer and the founder in the same frame. We have tried to name the people the sources forgot. We have tried to let the contradictions stand without forcing them into resolution. Whether we have succeeded is not ours to judge. The material resists summation. Eric resists summation. The colony resists summation. What we can offer is not a conclusion but an image, a final image, drawn from the materials at hand, honest about its limitations, offered without the pretense that it captures everything or resolves anything. Here is the image. A morning in the summer of 982. A man stands on the shore of a country that has run out of patience with him. We have been here before. This is where we began. The silver-white light of an Icelandic summer. The black volcanic stone, sharp underfoot. The wind off the water carrying the smell of open ocean. The ship loaded with provisions, livestock, thralls, and a family. The man with the copper beard and the broken knuckles and the knife at his belt that is not decorative. He is about to sail west. He does not know what he will find. He does not know that the fjords he will enter are habitable, or that the grass he will discover will be sufficient, or that the name he will choose will work, or that the people he will recruit will follow, or that the ships he will lead will mostly sink, or that the colony he will build will last 5 centuries, or that his son will reach a continent, or that his daughter will commit a massacre, or that his wife will build a church he hates, or that he will die of disease in a turf house at the head of a fjord he named after himself while the world he made begins to outgrow him. He knows none of this. He knows only the shore, the ship, the water, and the direction he must travel. He knows that behind him is a country that has declared him outside the law, and before him is an ocean that makes no such declarations because the ocean does not deal in law. The ocean deals in physics. Wind, current, temperature, the depth of the swell, the weight of the ice. The ocean is not just The ocean is not unjust. The ocean is a surface across which a sufficiently determined man in a sufficiently sturdy ship can move from one piece of land to another, if he is willing to accept the terms. And the terms are that the ocean may kill him and will not apologize. Eric accepted the terms. He had been accepting them his whole life. The terms of violence, the terms of exile, the terms of the frontier. Every place he had ever lived had presented him with a set of conditions and a set of consequences. And he had met the conditions and lived with the consequences, and when the consequences became intolerable, he had moved. Norway to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to nothing. The progression narrows. Each step leaves fewer options. Each expulsion closes a door. He is, at this moment on the shore, a man approaching the final narrowing, the point beyond which there is no further west to go, no further law to outrun, no further frontier to absorb the damage he does and convert it into founding. He does not know this either. He does not know that Greenland is his last country, that the fjords he will settle are the end of the line, that the chain of westward exile that began with his father ends with him. He thinks he is solving a problem. He is solving a problem. The problem is exile, and the solution is the same solution it has always been. Get on a boat, sail until you find a land, claim the land, make it yours. The simplicity of this is what makes it durable. Eric's story endures not because it is complicated, but because it is elemental, because the forces that drive it are forces that every human being recognizes. The need for a place to stand, the refusal to accept the place assigned, the willingness to cross deep water for the chance at a different life. These are not Viking impulses. They are human impulses, as old as the species, as current as the morning news, as permanent as the instinct that tells a living creature to move when the ground beneath it becomes untenable. Eric moved. He moved violently, selfishly, brilliantly, recklessly. He moved at the cost of other people's lives and at the risk of his own. He moved into the unknown with a confidence that was either courage or the absence of any better option. And the distinction between those two things may be less meaningful than we assume. He moved, and the movement produced a colony, and the colony produced a legacy, and the legacy produced the story that you are hearing now. 1,000 years after the man who set it in motion stood on a black shore and decided to get on a boat. The boat is gone. The shore is still there. The ocean between them is still there, gray and vast and undiminished, carrying the same currents that carried Erik's Nar across the Denmark Strait, indifferent to the passage of ships and centuries alike. Greenland itself is still there, changed, warming now in ways that would have been unimaginable to the Norse, and that carry their own set of consequences and ironies. The ice sheet that covered 4/5 of the island in Eric's time is diminishing, losing mass at a rate that accelerates each decade, calving icebergs into fjords that are less frozen than they have been in centuries, exposing bedrock that has not seen sunlight since before the Norse arrived. The warming that is now occurring is not the medieval warm period's gentle, cyclical fluctuation. It is something steeper, faster, driven by mechanisms that Eric could not have conceived, and that his descendants, had the colony survived, would only now be beginning to understand. The fjords of the eastern settlement are, for the first time in 500 years, approaching the temperatures they held when Eric sailed into them. The grass is growing longer, the ice is retreating, the conditions that made the colony possible, the brief, precarious window of warmth that opened in the 10th century and closed in the 14th, are reopening, though under circumstances so different that the comparison is more poignant than instructive. Eric would not recognize modern Greenland. The Inuit communities that dot the coastline live in painted wooden houses with electric lights and satellite dishes. Danish is spoken alongside Kala Alisut. Fishing trawlers and supply ships have replaced the Nar and the walrus-hunting Umiak. The ruins of the Norse settlements are archaeological sites, preserved and studied and visited by tourists who fly in from Reykjavik and Copenhagen to stand where Erik stood and take photographs of grass-covered mounds that were once the walls of longhouses. But the fjord at Bratalid still looks the way a fjord looks. The water is still black, the mountains still drop steeply to the waterline. The wind still comes off the ice cap. Diminished, perhaps, softened by the warming, but present, pressing against anything that stands upright, bending the grass, troubling the surface of the water. The fundamental geography has not changed. The rock is the same rock. The sky is the same sky. The light, in summer, is still the sourceless silver white of high latitudes, the sun circling the horizon without quite setting, the shadows long and pale and directionless. If you stand at the site of Bratalid on a summer evening and face the fjord, you can see what Erik saw. Not exactly. The ice margin has shifted, the vegetation has changed, the ruins of his farm are reduced to contours in the ground, but approximately. The bones of the landscape are unchanged. The proportions of water to sky to mountain to grass are the same proportions they were 1,000 years ago. The place persists. The man does not. This is the final asymmetry, the one that underwrites every historical narrative, the one that no amount of scholarship or storytelling can overcome. The places outlast the people. The stone outlasts the bone. The fjord outlasts the farm. The ice cap, even as it diminishes, will outlast every human structure built in its shadow, and the bedrock beneath it will outlast the ice cap. And the slow geological processes that shape the bedrock will continue long after the last human being has ceased to notice them. Erik Thorvaldsson, Sabamars. Erik the Red, the exile's son, the killer, the outlaw, the namer of frozen places, the persuader of desperate people, the father of the man who found a continent and the woman who bloodied an axe in Vinland, lived for approximately 55 years. His colony lived for approximately 500. His story has now lived for approximately 1,000, sustained by the chain of telling and retelling and writing and reading that connects his longhouse to your ears. The chain is fragile. It has always been fragile. It survived the transition from mouth to page, from page to print, from print to the digital medium through which you are receiving it now. At any point in that chain, a manuscript could have been lost, a library could have burned, a tradition could have been interrupted, and Erik would have vanished from memory as completely as the Dorset people who preceded him in the fjords. Present in the archaeological record, absent from the human one, a trace without a name. He did not vanish. The chain held. The story was told one more time, and one more time after that. And here we are at the end of another telling, having followed a red-haired man from a Norwegian fjord to an Icelandic shore, to a Greenlandic fjord, to a grave we cannot locate in soil that has absorbed his substance and returned it to the earth. The story will be told again. It will be told differently, with different emphasis, different omissions, different interpretive frameworks, different assumptions about what matters. The Erik of the next telling will not be the Erik of this one, just as the Erik of this one is not the Erik of the sagas, and the Erik of the sagas is not the Erik who lived. Each telling is a reconstruction. Each reconstruction is partial. The original is irrecoverable. We build what we can from the materials at hand, and we accept that the building is imperfect, and we offer it anyway because the alternative is silence, and silence is what the colony eventually became, and silence is not what Erik chose when he stood on that shore and decided to sail. He chose the crossing. He chose the risk. He chose the unknown over the impossible, and the crossing delivered him to a frozen shore at the edge of the world, where he built a house and named a country, and raised children who went farther than he did, and then he died. And the house fell, and the country emptied, and the children's children's children vanished into the cold, and the fjord remained. It remains. On a morning in the summer of whatever year this is, the light falls on the water at Bratalid the way it fell 1,000 years ago. The wind moves the grass. The mountains hold their shape against the sky. Somewhere beneath the surface of the soil, in the molecular residue of a life that ended 10 centuries past, the last physical trace of Erik Thorvaldsen participates in the chemistry of the earth, not as a man, not as a memory, but as material, as carbon and calcium and phosphorus, as the elemental substance from which a brief and violent and consequential life was temporarily assembled and to which it has long since been returned. The grass grows over him. It is green.